Stephanie's doing that, while Stephanie's getting us started this afternoon, I just will acknowledge that, like everyone, we've all been participating in these Zoom and similar types of meetings. We know there can be technical difficulties. We hope we don't experience it, but we might this afternoon. Just this morning, I was dropped from a call. And so if those things happen, we'll just be understanding and patient with them. In the unlikely event that I get dropped from the call, Vice Chair Barrasso, you just take the chair, continue with the meeting, and we'll all get back together just as soon as we can. I think I heard the notice that we're now recording. Isn't that right, Stephanie?
That is accurate, Chair George. Thank you.
Great. Well, welcome everyone to the September 17th, 2020 meeting of the Oregon Environmental Quality Commission. We welcome everyone here, our staff, our commissioners, and all of our guests. As we begin today, I think it's particularly important to pause and to have a little bit of moment of reflection as we get underway. Since the EQC last met, people across Oregon have been suffering the impacts of unprecedented wildfires throughout our state and our region. Up and down the West Coast, the destruction from these fires has been heartbreaking. I think it's important for us to acknowledge the tremendous losses that have been suffered by our fellow citizens. First, we mourn with those who have lost family and friends in the fires. This is devastating, and our thoughts go to all of them. We are thankful that more lives were not lost, and so grateful to the heroic efforts of those fighting on the front lines of the blazes and all the people working to get these fires under control. We also remember those who have lost homes, special places, and prized family treasures. These losses are traumatic, and some can never be replaced. We also recognize that millions of people have struggled with dangerous breathing conditions for more than a week. This is difficult and sickening in the short term and damaging to our health in the long term. And working with DEQ, one of the resources that we work to try to protect is clean air. And yet our recent experience was far beyond anyone's control. We know that many factors came together to create the dangerous conditions that Oregon has been facing, and scientists have warned for years that climate change was creating hotter, drier conditions that would make events like the one Oregon has been experiencing more common if we continue on our current path. So today, let's remember all those who have suffered losses, and again, pay tribute to the firefighters who are working so hard out there. And let us dedicate our work to working together to improve the conditions that have such dangerous potential. All right, well, with that, I want to officially start our meeting and start by reviewing the day's agenda. Director and commissioners, you have had the agenda. Do we believe at this time that we need any amendments to the agenda? All right, hearing none, we will proceed as written, and we always reserve the ability to be a little bit flexible if we need to be as we move through the agenda. So our first action item is the approval of the draft meeting minutes. Those also have been provided in advance. Do I hear any need to amend or correct the draft meeting minutes? Hearing none, I would entertain a motion to approve the draft minutes.
So moved.
Seconded.
Motion's been made and seconded. All those in favor, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Do we have any in opposition? The motion carries. Our minutes are approved. All right, with that, we'll move on to our first informational item, which is the State of the Environment Annual Update. This is a project that's been underway for a while, and we will turn it over to the director and staff to update us on this work.
Thank you, Chair George. Thank you, commissioners. Thank you for being here today, and thank you for everybody who's participating today. And I'll echo Chair George's thoughts. Our thoughts are with folks out there who are dealing with wildfires, dealing with loss, and also struggling with the air quality conditions out there. So recognizing that all that's going on, I really appreciate people being here this afternoon. Our first agenda item is the annual State of the Environment report. And I'll remind the commission, this is something we started to do in the spring of 2018 was the first one. This is the second time we've done the report, so we're a little beyond a year. But our intent is to bring a report like this to the commission at least once every year so that we can provide you and the public with information about how's Oregon doing in protecting this special place that we all call home and that we all treasure so much. So that's a very high level purpose of this report. There have been reports on the state of the Oregon environment over the years. I will note for the record that the last really comprehensive look at the environment in Oregon was done by a coalition of partners, including foundations and private sector partners back 20 years ago in the year 2000. And for folks who are particularly interested in the history of how Oregon's done in terms of protecting its environment, it's useful to go back and look at that snapshot 20 years ago and compare it to where we are today. At a high level, the way, if I were in an elevator with somebody and having to describe how have we done in the last 20 years, I would say it's complicated. We have made substantial progress in some areas. In general, the quality of air in the state of Oregon is certainly better than it was 20 years ago. There are some exceptions, specific exceptions to that, where we have some concerns. We're going to talk about that in the report today. Similarly, with regard to water, our water resources in the state of Oregon, there are many areas where things are better in Oregon than they were 20 years ago. 20 years ago was when salmon listings under the Federal Endangered Species Act first started. We haven't made a lot of progress with our endangered species in Oregon. We still are struggling, certainly in that regard. There are some aspects of water quality, though, that have improved, and you'll hear a little bit about that today. And it is important to talk both.
Director, I just want to acknowledge that at least for me.
Chair George? I'm sorry. Okay.
I apologize for interrupting, Director. I just want to acknowledge that I'm having difficulty hearing you off and on, and if anybody else is, if you could please raise your hand just so we know if it's a limited experience or if others are having difficulty hearing Director Whitman. No? All right.
Okay, thank you, Chair George. I will try to speak up a bit for you and any others that are having trouble hearing.
No worries. Looks like it might be limited. Please go ahead.
Well, my voice does tend to come and go, and I will say the air quality, I'm in DEQ headquarters right now, and the air quality inside the building is, let's just say, a little iffy. With that, I was saying in water quality, as in air quality, there are areas of both successes and also areas of disappointments and lack of progress. And I think it's important to acknowledge both of those as we look at big picture where we need to be focusing our efforts. And finally, in the area of the quality of our lands and how we manage materials here in Oregon, it's actually a pretty positive story in terms of the cleanups that we've completed and how we've done in terms of managing materials to avoid waste and use materials more sustainably. So with that, could I have the next slide, Stephanie, please? We have several types of measures that we track in Oregon regarding the state of our environment, and there are three main buckets of measures. On the left, you'll see the picture of the Oregon legislature, and for the Oregon legislature, we track what are called key performance measures. As part of our regular budget process, we report to the legislature every 2 years on status and trends in those key performance measure areas. And so some of the information you'll hear about today comes from our key performance measures. We also, working cooperatively with 40 other states around the country through the Environmental Council of the States, track some measures, a small set of measures across all the states and in the same way, so that we can really get a national picture of how Oregon is doing in the context of national trends. And there'll be a few things that we report on today that come out of those measures. And then finally, DEQ has been very active in the area of performance management and performance measures for a long time. That's been a big focus of past leadership at DEQ, and many managers, and staff at DEQ have put a lot of effort into our performance management system. We meet every quarter in DEQ with leadership and managers and staff to review how we've done for the prior quarter for each of those key performance measures. For each of the performance measures in that system. And our acronym, since this is a government agency, we have to have an acronym, is quarterly management review, or our QMR system. And we meet every quarter to review that. And so many of the measures that you'll hear about today come out of that effort as well. And then finally, you're also going to hear from Lori Pillsbury today about data collection at DEQ's lab and some of our systems, which include data collection and analysis using data both collected by DEQ, but also collected by other agencies, federal and state and local agencies, and private partners as well. So there's a lot of tracking that we do of Oregon's environment, both on a micro scale and a macro scale. The challenge really is to take all that data and put it in systems and in reporting that allow us to convey what's going on. So it's not, we could always use more data, don't get me wrong, but we have a lot of data, and what we don't do as good a job on is analyzing and reporting on the data that we do have. Next slide, please. So that's what I want to talk about. What I just ended on, the lack of reporting and analysis, is something that we're very focused on working on here over the next couple of years. We are launching, as most of you know, but for those who are following along in the public should know, DEQ is just beginning work on a strategic planning effort. And over the next several months, we will begin our process of an environmental scan, talking to our partners, people that we work with, people within the agency, with individual environmental quality commissioners about the strategic plan for the agency and getting your feedback. So for commissioners, this will be coming to you shortly. As part of that effort, as we work through what's the vision, what are the goals for the agency, once we work through the very high level strategic plan for the agency, we do want to refresh our performance measures so that they tie directly to our strategic plan. They tie to that vision, they tie to the specific goals, so that we are tracking the right things in terms of environmental and public health outcomes, and can make those part of the regular report to the commission and the public on the state of the environment. So look forward to talking to you all more about the strategic plan a little bit more tomorrow in the director's report. but I wanted to bring it up here as well because there's a direct tie between this agenda item and the strategic plan. And then next slide, Stephanie. So what I want to end on is this is kind of where we would like to be in a year or two from now after we complete the strategic planning process. This is a so-called stoplight chart that is prepared by the state of Minnesota in their environmental state agency that gives the public a high-level picture of where things are, how things are, both in terms of status and trend on certain key measures that are tracked over time. And there's a whole infrastructure that's built in Minnesota to support this effort. They've actually got an office of, I think it's 8 people that do this work. We're not going to be in a position to afford as robust an effort in Oregon, but we do collect a lot of data and we already spend a fair amount of time analyzing it. So again, I think we can move towards something like this in the future. So with that, I'm going to end my opening remarks here. I'll be back participating in part of the presentation as we first go through Oregon's environmental lab. Lori Pillsbury is going to present to you on what types of data we are collecting and analyzing and reporting on. And then we are going to hear from Ali Mirzakalili about the outcome measures on air quality in Oregon. Then Jennifer Weigel is going to present on status and trends in water quality measures. And finally, we're going to have a presentation on how we're doing on land and sustainable materials management. Lydia Eamer is not able to be here today to do that presentation. And so, Leah, correct me if I'm wrong, who is doing that presentation? Are you doing that? Yeah, okay.
Not me, actually, Abby Baduris, who the commission's heard from before. She's a senior legislative and policy advisor for the land quality program.
Thank you, Leah. So that's a high-level overview of this agenda item. Let me just pause and Chair George, see if there are any questions from the commission at this point.
Commissioners, do you have any comments or questions after the introduction? Not seeing any. And you know, if I do happen to miss a raised hand in these small screens that we're working on, feel free to also use a reaction button. If I've ever missed a hand, just use one of those and that'll draw it to my attention quickly. Go ahead with the rest of the presentation.
Okay, thank you, Chair George. So now I'm going to turn it over to Lori Pillsbury, who's the administrator for Oregon's environmental lab. Thanks, Lori.
Thank you, Director Whitman. Good afternoon, Chair George and commissioners. Can everybody hear me okay? Thumbs up? Yeah, great. For the record, my name is Lori Pillsbury and I am the Laboratory Division Administrator for DEQ. As Director Whitman mentioned, we're here today to take a look at the measurement of environmental outcomes across the state. And in order to do this measurement, data are critical. We need data to evaluate these environmental outcomes, and the DEQ laboratory is responsible for collecting much of the environmental data that we use to calculate the measures that you're going to hear about from our division administrators, our media administrators. Fortunately, the lab had the privilege of hosting you all back in January before everything changed for us. So at that time, I, along with laboratory staff and managers, were able to share with you much of the work that we do to support our agency programs and to support Oregonians. Next slide, please, Stephanie. And so I'm not going to go through these in every detail, but I'm going to go back and just provide you an overview of many of the monitoring programs that we discussed back in January. But on this slide, I've structured them into 3 categories to correspond to the environmental outcomes that they provide data to measure that you'll see more about later in the presentation. So monitoring the environment over time. These are our status and trends programs that provide us the ability to track environmental changes over time. Many of these programs, such as the ambient river monitoring and the National Air Toxics Trend Sites, have been going on for decades and are long-term. These are the core of our monitoring activities that we conduct that really give us a good picture of environment as it has changed over time. The next category of environmental outcomes, protecting human health in vulnerable communities. You know, just looking outside over the past week, this is especially important during this time. Of course, in the news right now, our air quality index and the monitoring that feeds that are critical at this time for everyone. Is providing a basis for decision making for all aspects of Oregonians' lives, whether it be their work, the recreation, their health. Another program that I'll highlight here is our beach monitoring. This is in federal partnership. We receive grant money to do beach monitoring, and we collect coastal bacteria data that's also utilized to make health decisions about beach closures in conjunction with the Oregon Health Authority. The third category of environmental outcomes is engaging partners and citizen scientists. So we do this in a variety of our programs. We have initiatives to engage volunteer groups through partnerships and funding from OWEB and others. That includes our water quality volunteer monitoring. In air quality, we have staff representing us on work groups with EPA and the American Association of Public Health Laboratories to learn and find new ways that we can integrate this citizen science that is being collected into our activities, so to provide greater coverage across the state and much more information to the public. An example of this are low-cost sensors that are available to monitor PM 2.5 called Purple Air, and they're being deployed everywhere, and they're a little bit different in their quality than our sensors, but we're working with other groups to analyze that difference and explain that difference and be able to utilize that data to provide greater coverage across the state. That's just one example. The pesticide stewardship partnerships is a collaboration across sister agencies as well as grower groups and farmers to make on-the-ground changes that are voluntary that really do lead to environmental outcomes outside of the regulatory process. Next slide, please. Thank you. Of course, with all these programs, we're collecting an enormous amount of data, not only with our own data collection, but also with the data that we're receiving from our volunteer groups and partner groups. And we manage this data through a few systems that have been improved in recent years, but there is still more work to do, as we learned this week when we had server issues with our AQI. We've been receiving tens of thousands of hits a day on our server and have really been trying to keep that going and keep it working so that people have the information they need. This particular photo here in the middle is a snapshot from the AirNow app on my phone. We had to get the presentation done so it could be submitted to you all. So this certainly wasn't the worst of our AQI that we saw over the last week. I have some snapshots where they're all in that deep purple maroon hazardous, not unhazardous, excuse me, hazardous for everyone group. And so this information is invaluable, and we're managing that through some public systems that are public facing and provide us access to the data online and through apps. We also exchange our data with federal systems, including EPA's air quality system, as well as EPA's water quality system data, which is called WQX or STORET. And that gives our data a greater reach. It allows access outside of Oregon, but also within Oregon to more partners and other groups that might want to utilize our data. In our systems, we're currently housing not only our data, as I mentioned, but also data from our volunteer groups, data from, that is, we go out for a call for data and have it submitted to us to feed our integrated report, which you'll hear about. You'll see a measure on the integrated report in a bit. And so we really are managing a tremendous amount of data, but we can do better. There's still data out there we don't have, that we're not getting. So further collaboration with sister agencies such as ODF&W, OWRD, in order to get their data and bring it into our system. In addition, expansion of a real-time data system. We have it, an example here is the app for Air Now is nearly real time, but we don't have a similar system in water. And that's, something that an expansion of that sort of data system is also a future goal and future work. And then as Richard mentioned earlier, just more public display, more reporting, and more information generated from our data and from all the data that we're collecting. Next slide, please. Along with providing the data to communicate the outcomes and measures you'll hear about, the laboratory also provides reports and communications directly outside of these measures. And I've touched on a few of those already with the air quality index and the beach reporting. But I'd like to point out a couple of additional ones that I have highlighted here. The first one is our water quality toxics monitoring. A lot of toxic pollutants don't have criteria across the state, but this monitoring was funded, well, I think now back in 2007 by the legislature. And the purpose of this is to look at the prevalence of toxic contaminants in water bodies across the state. And so we report on this information, and we also provide it to the Oregon Health Authority to inform fish consumption advisories that they may need to issue. I'd also like to highlight our statewide groundwater monitoring program, which on this slide is reflected as well owner reports. The statewide groundwater program relies on volunteer homeowners to volunteer their wells to be evaluated in areas that we have determined are vulnerable for contamination. We then provide these homeowners a report that outlines what we've found, explains the results, and provides them resources to follow up, whether that's following up through their local health departments or through the Oregon Health Authority. In addition, we're summarizing this data on a regional level, looking at the groundwater quality in that vulnerable area. So for example, one area this was done in recently, and the report is out on the North Coast area up near the Clatsop Plain up in the North Coast. In addition, oh, sorry, is there a question? I'm sorry, Commissioner.
Hey, Lori, there were some reports today where you were talking about air quality sensors that evidently a bunch of air quality sensors went offline. Could you update us on what was going on? Was it caused by cell towers, or what's going on there?
Well, so across the state, we have a variety of reasons for sensors going offline, and I don't know exactly which sensor you have a question about, but we have some that have gone offline due to power loss. We have sensors that are located in the fire affected areas, and those are offline potentially for obvious reasons. And we also have sensors that are starting to go offline because the filters are clogging due to the PM 2.5, and because of the hazardous air conditions, we haven't been able to get out there and replace those filters to bring those sensors back online. I can tell you that our field guys are just waiting until we give them the go ahead to get back out there and get everything back online. And we expect, as the air is looking a little clearer outside my window today, that will be out soon, getting those back online. But those are likely the three causes of the offline sensors. The other part of air quality that we are recently expanded our program with a couple years ago after the metals issues in downtown Portland is our air toxics monitoring and air toxics community assessments. And that's another reporting that we're doing as we're reporting on air toxics information and data in a community, not just related to a specific source. So that highlights just a little bit of our reports and our data and our monitoring. And I'm not sure, Stephanie, are we doing questions after each one? I can pause to see if there's any questions before I pass it off to Ali to discuss air quality. Yes, sir, Director Whitman.
So just, yes, I would suggest we proceed that way. I should have said that at the outset. Take questions from commissioners after each of these segments of the presentation. So if you've got questions for Lori, now would be the time to raise them.
Okay, Commissioner Addington.
Thank you, Chair George. And Lori, I just wanted to make a comment that I participated here in the Klamath Basin with some well gathering data. And I just wanted to really acknowledge that program. And I didn't know anything about it. And the staff was wonderful. Paige was great. I got the results back. My only thing is there's a lot of resources there to follow up, but there's also so much information. It's a little bit overwhelming. It'd be cool if there was like some sort of, dumbed down version that says, everything looks pretty good or it doesn't. But I just want to really acknowledge the program that I didn't know existed, and it was run really professionally and well.
Well, thank you. Thank you for that feedback. I appreciate it. I think that is one thing that I would like to do as we, move forward with our laboratory monitoring, is getting the word out more about the programs that we do have and the monitoring that we do conduct proactively, so that, people are understanding the good work that we're doing and the staff is doing here. So I appreciate that, and I will pass that along to Paige as well.
Anybody else? Commissioner Kyle.
I just want to really also express my appreciation for some of this real-time air quality monitoring. We here in Corvallis have been using it to make determinations about whether the university is open or our local farmers markets will run, and really kind of just practical use of real-time air quality monitoring data. So the applications for this information are vast, and it is a super important resource to have for making decisions on the ground. So I hope that those sensors that are offline just due to filter clogging can come back on pretty soon, because it does provide really useful information for the local communities. So thank you for doing that.
Thank you very much. And I didn't point out, but I will add that that network is ever expanding with our low-cost sensor boxes that you saw some information about when you were at the laboratory. And you'll notice, if you were to have looked at the air quality map last year, a couple of years ago, you'll see many more sites on this year now that we have been deploying those sensors as well.
That's great news, Lori. I'm sure that hundreds of Oregonians who probably never gave their air quality too much thought were seeking out these apps and this data here recently. And we have very quickly come to appreciate the relatively high air quality we usually enjoy. So it's wonderful that these resources are there when people do need them. Thank you for that.
Thank you.
Any other questions before we move on? All right, doesn't look like it. Ali, welcome.
Good afternoon, Chair George, commissioners. For the record, my name is Ali Mirzakhalili, Air Quality Division Administrator with the EQ. It's great to see you all. It's been a little while, so I hope you're all doing well. First, before I get started, I just gotta join the chorus and thank Lori's team for doing a wonderful job of generating the data, and the team's ability to maintain these sensors and provide the data has been just enormously helpful and important during this time. And ongoing the data. So much of what I'm going to present to you is the work that's generated by that team. So thank you, Lori, and thank you for your team. With that said, let's jump right into it. Next slide, please. So this one is a chart of number of unhealthy air days statewide. It is a tally of all locations statewide. So of AQI. I believe we take it from 29 communities. So it's a cumulative. If you see the number of days add up to almost more than a number of days in a year, that's why. This measure is based on the air quality index, or AQI, which is an index calibrated to health-based levels for each of the criteria of pollutants. In Oregon, the most important contributor to high AQI days are ozone, and as recently experienced, is PM 2.5. The purple color represents days that were in the unhealthy, very unhealthy, and hazardous AQI ranges. And the orange colors represent the days in the unhealthy for sensitive groups category. The darker purple and darker orange portion of the bars represent the contribution from wildfires, which while the lighter purple and lighter orange portion of the bars represent a contribution from human activity. As you can see, that the wildfire contribution in 2017 and 18 were were significant. So the KPI goals are less than 20 days per year in the unhealthy for sensitive groups category and less than 3 days in the unhealthy or worse categories. Again, the large number of unhealthy air quality days per year are due to wildfires. 2017 and 2018 were the worst years in terms of AQI and wildfires that we've seen since we had started recording, keeping records. We were lucky in 2019, but I think that 2020 probably will set new records, unfortunately. So we have several programs to try and reduce unhealthy air days. As far as the anthropogenic emissions are concerned, we have our heat smart and local wood stove replacement programs, our smoke management plans, addressing ozone forming pollutants from our VIP program, low emission vehicles, and clean diesel programs. Next one, please. So this figure shows the percent deviation from national ambient air quality standards for ground level ozone, particulate matter, and carbon monoxide. So under the Clean Air Act, EPA sets and reviews national ambient air quality standards, or NAQS, for 6 common outdoor air pollutants. We call it criteria air pollutants. And they're set at a level necessary to protect public health. What we're showing here, we're not showing lead, SO2, and NO2. They're generally, well below the standard. So we're showing you these selected others. As you can see, we are generally meeting these standards. However, ozone concentration measures in Portland in the 2017, 18, and 19 exceeded the standard of 70 parts per billion. Wildfires contribute to these exceedances by sending more volatile organic compounds and nitrogen oxides into the air. But since ozone is a secondary form pollutant, we can't discern if we would have had ozone exceedances anyway because of other sources. That's not, the wildfire, for instance, is not an issue for ozone this time of the year. But what are other sources like cars coupled with high temperature is what create ozone. And we have a number of programs to address these ozone precursor emissions. Vehicle inspection program is mainly one dealing with ozone and carbon monoxide. Our heat smart program, federal low sulfur requirements to address SO2 and PM. Our regional haze program has a secondary benefit of ambient air quality impact, and wood smoke management programs and wood stove replacement. We also work with communities to address a lot of voluntary issues.
Commissioner Kyle.
So I really like seeing these kind of trend data because you can learn a lot. And even though you said that NOx wasn't on this graph because it's generally below the NAQS, which is good, but it would be interesting to see the parallel, if there are parallel trends between NOx and O3, since 2019 was a low air quality or good air quality year based on the previous slide, but it's showing a flat line with previous years. So I guess my question is I think you can start to tease out some of the relationships here with traffic and traffic related air pollutants. And if you include NOx in your trend, you would start to be able to see the parallel or unparalleled aspects of those trends. So I would encourage including those other pollutants in this reporting, even if they are well below the NAQS, because you can tell a lot from that. But I really do appreciate this data and seeing the data in this way, because I think it is very informative.
Okay, thank you, Commissioner Kyle. We will add that to the chart.
Commissioner Barrasso. Vice Chair Barrasso, did you have a question or comment?
You're on mute.
Sorry, I was muted elsewhere. Okay, so I'd love to, can you hear me now? Okay, thank you, Ali. What I'd love to know is, I'm seeing this trend line with the PM 2.5 and then the carbon monoxide. What I don't understand is those trend lines are going slightly downward, whereas the ozone is going up. So, and I know you described a few things that contribute to that, but do we have a sense why one set of indicators are going downward? And I know, Molly, you were speaking to that a little bit as well, but do we have a sense for what's happening there?
So we've, if you look at, for instance, for ozone, I would say our, the last decade, there isn't a downward trend. We're a flat line. If you can see that the ozone trend, and we see an increase. That's likely, to tease out what the exact impact is, likely related to increase of, vehicle miles traveled and our mobile source emissions, increased temperatures. We may have hot 90-degree days. We have to go and tease out those reasons for them as well. The number of, meteorology has a lot to do with, some of these secondary pollutant formations. And PM 2.5 falls into that category. It's a secondary pollutant as well as a primary pollutant. So you get nitrogen, for instance, it forms nitrates, which is an aerosol. Sulfur, dioxide, creates sulfate particles. So there's trying to tease out that atmospheric chemistry and see what precursors contributed and which day. It is one that's a bit challenging, and we need to do more of that data analysis.
Director Whitman.
Yeah, I'm going to echo a little bit what Ali said. It's just being fairly familiar with on the greenhouse gas emissions front, at least the shape of the curve on ozone correlates very closely with what we've seen on vehicle miles traveled and GHG emissions in the transportation sector in particular. And a large part of that is driven, no pun intended, from freight and trucks, as well as from passenger vehicles.
And just not to complicate things, but the form of the standard also plays a part. For instance, the ozone standard is the fourth highest 8-hour average at a station that we measure. So it's not a we may be looking at an afternoon episode that was related to some anomaly that put that number above this. Put our fourth highest number above the standard. So we just need to tease that out. The PM 2.5 is an annual standard, is probably more representative of what's going on a day-to-day basis. But 24 averages, again, subject to the same, episodic, investigation. And we had some inversion episodes last year that probably caused a good bit of exceedances in our PM 2.5 measurements. Thank you. Thank you for those questions. Chair George, if I may. Next slide, please. So this shows our diesel tracks already progress towards diesel emissions. As you know, diesel engines are known for their reliability, durability, power, and fuel efficiency. However, the particle, particulate exhaust from diesel engines is known to pose a serious health risk. For that reason, in 2007, the state legislature established a goal to reduce excess lifetime risk of cancer from diesel emissions to 1 in a million in 2017. Measured on a total tons per year basis, that target required reducing emissions to 250 tons per year. The most recent data from EPA's 2017 National Emissions Inventory shows that 2,375 tons of diesel particulate matter was emitted in Oregon. This, along with historic inventory trends data, is shown with a solid yellow line. DEQ's previous efforts, while effective at reducing diesel emissions, proved inadequate to meet the previous KPM goal. In 2018, we proposed a change to the targets outlined in statute. The new amended KPM targets extend to 2023 and can be seen in the dashed green or blue line, which extrapolates the target out to 2041, which would be the year in which Oregon would need to meet the original goal. We are currently at, as of 2017, about 13% above the target, about the revised targets. The dashed orange line reflects the normal turnover trends assisted with maximizing cost-effective use of our PW settlement funds. This projection has Oregon meeting the original goal in 2044. The 2017 legislative action directed the EQ to use VW funds to reduce emissions from at least 450 diesel school buses through exhaust control retrofits or total replacement. Our staff to date have managed to get nearly 30% of the way towards that goal, with at least 130 buses replaced or retrofitted. While the total investment may not represent the greatest potential reduction in diesel emission, reduced exposure to children benefit a sensitive population. This results in lower lifetime morbidity and mortality associated with diesel pollution exposure. And I think that sort of reflects why that strategy was chosen. In 2021, we expect to roll out a new competitive grant program, and that rulemaking is underway now, that will distribute the remaining VW funds, which is about $50 million. Through this new program, we expect to realize even more diesel PM reduction from a variety of sources. These dollars will be focused on older vehicles and equipment regulated under HB 2007, which was the most recent legislative action on diesel. Next one, please. And so I want to talk a little about regional haze. Regional haze rule was issued following the Clean Air Act adoption. The goal of regional haze program is to improve visibility in Class 1 areas, which are national parks, monuments, etc., back to natural background conditions by 2064. Regional haze is a long-term program that sets goals for visibility improvements in 10-year intervals, with interim checks every 5 years. Baseline conditions were set at 2000-2004 observation, and natural conditions are different for every Class 1 area and set on a specific site-specific basis. So essentially the requirement is to connect the baseline visibility to the 2064 goal and a straight line, the called glide path that we need to stay under to get to, and that's at the 10-year marks and 5-year review times is how we get there. But the good news is that currently observed visibility at all of Oregon's Class 1 areas at the end of 2018 were below the uniform rate of progress, which is that straight line method that I was talking about. The concern is that with current EPA modeling, the majority of Oregon's Class 1 area will no longer be meeting our visibility improvement by 2028 if we take no further action. In addition, for the 4 Class 1 areas where it seems that we are meeting projected visibility goals in 2028, monitoring shows that NOx levels in those areas are above the glide path for visibility impairment. Even in cases where the observed visibility values are below the target, EPA guidance has mandated that states need to continue to show reasonable progress in the visibility. So that work continues, and we'll be bringing you a plan probably later next year. Next, please. So this one is shows our long-term air toxics trends. We've identified ambient benchmark concentrations or ABCs for 55 air toxics. The ABCs are a measure of health risk posed by an air toxics. As the ambient concentration of air toxics increases, so does the health risk it poses. For this key performance measure, 5 air toxics, cadmium, arsenic, benzene, acetaldehyde, and formaldehyde were selected out of the list of 55 as indicator species. The target is to decrease ambient concentration of each of these 5 air toxics to be at or below their respective ABC by 2020. That is 1 time the ABC or less. If we stack the 5 indicator air toxics, we would expect the stacks bar to be at or below 5. To track this KPM, the Air Quality Monitoring Section monitors these 5 indicators at 2 sites in the state, an urban location in Portland and a rural location at La Grande, as shown on the map. And again, I want to point out these are not intended to be related to any specific source. They're designed to give you a general indication of air quality for a broader area. So how are we doing with respect to air toxics performance measures? Again, we're seeing a decreasing trend in KPM at both Portland and La Grande from 2004 to 2019. About 40 times ABC, which was where we started, to 20 times the ABC in Portland, and from 80 times ABC to about 20 times in La Grande. We're not meeting the target of 5 times over ABC at either location. Part of the reason is the change in the ABC for formaldehyde. It was changed from 3 microgram per cubic meter to 0.2. In practical terms, if formaldehyde had been at or close to its ABC in 2018, it would be at 1 times the ABC. That is the threshold of the acceptable risk in the 1 in a million. Without the change, we would be at 10 instead of where we are at in 2019. And for respect to other toxics, cadmium is in orange at the top of the bar, has been way below the ABC historically at La Grande, and in Portland it has now been reduced to near benchmark. Arsenic, the next in light blue, poses a greater risk in Portland than in La Grande, currently being around 4 times the ABC. It has been stable at this level in Portland for the past 5 years or so, possibly an indication that current risk is coming from volcanic soil of the region rather than anthropogenic emissions. But this needs to be further investigated. The remaining 3 air toxics, benzene, acetaldehyde, and formaldehyde, are cumulatively 15 times ABC in both Portland and La Grande, and therefore are the main contributors to health risk. Again, sources of those 3 pollutants are the anthropogenic sources are from gasoline and light duty vehicles and residential wood burning. However, those contribute to a very small fraction of our inventory. Most of this is driven by wildfire in the Portland area and prescribed fires in La Grande, based on our 2017 emissions inventory. Next, please. I think, Director Whitman, I'm turning this over to you, this slide.
All right, thank you, Ali. Chair George, Commissioners, for the record, Richard Whitman, DEQ Director. So I have this one slide on greenhouse gas emissions reduction, and the points I want to make here is we have existing direction from the Oregon legislature that was put in place in 2007 that called for us to stop the increase in greenhouse gas emissions by 2010, and for us to achieve a 10% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by 2020 and a 75% reduction by the year 2050. Here we are in 2020, so we're at that second check-in point that the legislature set in the 2007 legislation. And instead of being 10% below our 1990 levels, we are 10% above our 1990 levels. So we are headed in the wrong direction. And we are now, roughly 20% off target for GHG reductions. I also want to remind the Commission these goals that were set in legislation in 2007 weren't just pulled out of thin air. They were calculated based on the level of emissions reductions that need to occur globally in order for us to achieve or avoid the worst effects of climate change. So this is not saying that Oregon has to do more than its fair share in terms of addressing our climate crisis. These goals were set on the premise that Oregon would do its fair share. And right now we're not. I'll go into just a little bit more detail on this, and then we're done with the air section and can open it up for questions. But the main driver in terms of why we are not meeting our 2020 goal is the amount that you and I are driving, and the amount that we are asking our freight system to move goods around to support our economy and way of life, and the amount of fossil fuel that we're burning with all of that activity. In terms of, and so transportation is by far the largest sector, and we have not made the progress in terms of reducing the amount that people drive or in making our cars cleaner that we had hoped we were going to make. We have made progress in getting our fuels cleaner. That's our Clean Fuels program, of which I'm proud. That is one area where we are making specific progress in reducing greenhouse gas emissions. The second largest source of greenhouse gas emissions is electricity, the electricity we all consume here in Oregon. And historically, Oregon, along with other Western states, was fairly heavily dependent on coal in addition to hydroelectric power. And we have done a pretty good job. Our utilities have done a good job in terms of substituting in renewable sources of electricity for coal. And because of that, we are starting to see greenhouse gas emissions from electricity come down pretty significantly. But that's frankly being swamped by things going in the wrong direction in the transportation sector. The other sectors are fairly stable. And you'll be hearing a lot more about all of them as we work on greenhouse gas emissions here over the next year and a half. So with that, I'll stop on that. Just a recap for the commission. I started out this presentation by saying it's complicated and some things are getting better and some things are not getting better. You've seen that in the air presentation that Ali just presented. In a lot of respects, our air is cleaner and more healthy than it was 10 years ago. We do have issues. The big issues are what we're experiencing right now in terms of wildfire smoke. And that is going to be an issue going on into the future, a major public health issue for the state, how to deal with that. We have some localized issues with air toxics and diesel in terms of cumulative impacts on particular communities that are important and that need to be addressed. We've got the greenhouse gas emissions issues that I just talked about. And we've got ozone that we're keeping our eye on. But otherwise, in a number of respects, things are getting better in terms of air quality. So with that, I'll stop, and we'd invite questions, Chair George, for Ali.
Commissioner Mosby.
Yes, I've got a comment and then a question for Ali. First, going back to slide 14, Ali, you mentioned LeGrand had a high formaldehyde level, and to me that's not surprising. For a small community, one of the largest employers is a wood-based particle board plant that uses a formaldehyde-based resin, so I guess that one does not surprise me. And my comment goes back to the question, the diesel fine particle where you talked about there, that scenario we've had a little problem with. I've got a question for you. Obviously, technology and electric vehicles will really help, but I think we all realize that, and the director alluded to it, that transportation, especially freight transportation, is really a major component here. My question is, if a combination of technology, which electric trucks, let's hope we'll see in the future, and if we can ever get this interstate bridge project going where we can see hopefully the clutter on the I-5 freeway, which is almost a 24-hour deal going north. If that I-5 came through and we had, rather than clogged I-5, and we had normal 45-mile-an-hour traffic most of the time on I-5, would that help us with the diesel particulate in Portland, especially in the metro area?
Chair George, Commissioner Mosby, thank you for the question. I think it's a little more complicated than that. What we see in terms of which freight, a lot of the age of the vehicles that we see are different in our fleet. For instance, the mix that we are seeing on the transit versus what local delivery, and those are the dirtier trucks, vehicle trucks, and freight trucks seems to be more of a local thing as opposed to the through fare. So if expanding and enhancing, we may be putting more trucks on a road as opposed to the older ones. I don't know. I mean, that's that we need to calculate that and see how that mix works. But we do need to address the freight vehicles that are in service now. And as I mentioned, as you well know, they're reliable, they'll last forever, and we just got to find a way to retire them and put them to pasture, or just be able to retrofit them and get that going. As you know, there is a requirement for registration or retrofit for these vehicles in place starting year 1996 and then to 2006, and those we're working on that regulatory effort now. RAC meetings this Friday to begin rules around that registration and what is that retrofit requirement would look like. So I think we need to address those, but certainly we're part of the medium heavy duty ZEV, and electrification of that fleet is probably the long-term answer to our issues.
Commissioner Kyle.
So I had a question to follow up on that, because in the last couple meetings, we've read the diesel emission inventory report. We've talked about some of the environmental justice issues in our more dense urban areas that are a result of diesel traffic. And in your presentation, when you were talking about that, you mentioned that there's going to be rules around the reinvestment of the extra VW settlement to kind of upgrade and reduce those diesel emissions. So my question is the timeline for when the rules would be for that investment of the extra VW settlement money to improve our diesel fleet. And if there is an opportunity here to look for win-wins where some of that reinvestment is directed to where that diesel inventory, and some of our environmental justice communities have pointed out that you're kind of getting a double whammy of old diesel and high particulate levels.
Chair George, Commissioner Kyle, that's exactly right. So as we are building our rules, and I think it's going through the stakeholder input with trying to build our decision matrix and priorities of how do we invest, how do we rank the project proposals that we get, and which ones we fund over another. Those are the criteria that we are incorporating into our thinking into the matrix, and trying to evaluate which projects to fund over other ones. Our priority is those that give us maximum emissions reduction and impact the community. So we are creating a ranking scheme and scoring scheme that hopefully will be responsive to all of the points that you raised, and we will bring in that rulemaking before you as well.
And could I follow up with a question? Who is in that conversation? You mentioned you're engaging with stakeholders. Who is on that RAC?
I don't have that list in front of me. We can certainly get you the RAC membership. We try to reach out to the representative from the communities and various environmental groups.
So just to follow up on that line of discussion, either Ali or Director Whitman, what is the approximate time frame of that process and getting to those sets of recommendations that would then move forward into a rulemaking?
Chair George, that process is underway now. They had 1 or 2 meetings already. I think we're getting to the point of crafting the rule language and getting it out to public comment. So it's close.
So we'd be moving forward to rulemaking within 6 months, within a few months?
Within 6 months, certainly.
Yeah, if I could, Chair George, again, for the record, Richard Whitman, DQ Director, I believe it's January or March EQC meeting.
Very good. Very good. We'll look forward to seeing that. That's exciting work. Important. Vice Chair Barrasso, did I see you indicating you might have a comment or question? The one comment or question I had was for those indicators where we're not meeting our goals, and for example, Director, you were using the greenhouse gas emissions where it's fairly well known where some of our biggest obstacles are, and you discussed those. Will this report speak to those areas of work? I know sometimes departments are a little bit are a little bit reluctant to identify what is needed, but I mean, the figure before us about greenhouse gas emissions, I think it's fairly well understood where some of our biggest challenges lay. Will this report, at least to some degree, speak to, I don't want to use the phrase necessarily low-hanging fruit, because not all these things are easy, but in some cases they are really obvious where the work needs to go to make real progress?
Thanks, Chair George. For the record, Richard Whitman. The report as it exists right now in narrative form is the staff report that you have. There is no formal report that we're releasing to the public beyond that at this point. We will present a version of this to the full session of the Oregon legislature, which will start in late January of next year as part of our budget presentation and perhaps as part of an agency overview. So there'll be another opportunity to educate the public about these issues and about potential, what the solutions and roadblocks are at that point. But your question raises a good point. Should we be putting out a more formal narrative report for the public on this? And as we talk about the strategic planning effort over the course of the next year, that is something that I would very much like to talk about in that context, because I think it would be good for us to be doing that on a regular basis. The question is how to set it up for success and build the support around it so that it happens every year and it's not a one-off report like the very good one that was done in the year 2000, but which has not been repeated since.
I think that's a great insight, and was glad to see the tie in to the strategic planning effort at the beginning, because like you, I believe that these are the kinds of metrics and/or trends that we should be looking to guide the key decisions that need to be made as part of the strategic planning effort. Okay, well, with that, one last call here. Oh, I think that.
Yeah, George, I just wanted to, I just looked up the date for our public hearing. It's October 19th for the Volkswagen rule. So we are going to notice, hopefully, as long as we can manage the internal paperwork, and so that's the date we're targeting. So we're very close to getting that rule out there.
Thank you for that information. That's great to hear. We'll be, I think a lot of folks will be looking forward to hearing where that is leading. Any other comments or questions on the presentation? Okay, none. Thank you all very much. This is important work, and the kind of looking at progress that it is very important for the department to do. So thanks for that presentation. We are now due for a short break. Let's
Sure,
go
George.
ahead. Yes, Director.
I'm so sorry to interrupt you, but we have two other parts of this presentation still for the commission.
Oh,
on water quality and then also on land quality as well.
I'm terribly sorry. Please go ahead and continue. We're actually not even at break time, so by all means continue.
Okay, thank you, Chair George. And so with that, let me just double check and make sure who's doing this next presentation from the program. Jennifer or Justin?
Yeah.
Okay. Jennifer Weigel, thank you.
Welcome, Jennifer.
Yes, thank you. Good afternoon, Chair George and the rest of the commissioners. For the record, my name is Jennifer Weigel, and I'm the Deputy Water Quality Administrator. So I will be talking to you today about the water quality related measures that we have, as well as other indicators of water quality that we are looking at. So I will start with the next slide, Stephanie. The first slide here is we're going to talk a little bit about the key performance measure that the water quality program reports on, which is based on the water quality index. So you have probably seen this before. The water quality index, what that is in a nutshell, is it assesses water quality at 160 ambient monitoring sites across the state that DEQ maintains. These are stationary locations, and generally these sites are intended to be situated within the watershed that give us a high-level sense of what water quality is doing, basically kind of upstream and throughout the waters that are upstream of these locations. These sites we visit, Lori's staff visits every 2 months and collect grab sample data for 8 different parameters. The index itself aggregates 10 years worth of data for those parameters at each location. And then they develop a aggregated score, and then we produce then an annual report and look at how these index scores change over time. Generally speaking, like I said, this is a high level look at water quality and is intended generally for non-technical audiences to get a sense of what water quality is looking like. So this figure depicts the metric performance in relation to the 3 sub-measures within the key performance measure that we report on. So I'm going to kind of take it slowly step by step because this can be a little bit complicated to look at. So start with the green bars. Those green bars represent the percent of sites that have improving trends in water quality. The red bars show the percent of sites with declining trends in water quality. And the purple line is the percentage of those sites that are in excellent or good condition. And so you can see, generally speaking, that the number that we've been doing, the number of sites with improving trends had been increasing, and then in 2019 we see a little dip in that, and we are seeing a general increase in the percent of sites with declining trends. At the same time, you can see that the number of sites in excellent or good condition have been staying more or less steady with a slight uptick.
This is Kathleen. Green is generally improving, red is generally declining. So then we're left to assume that all those waters that fall into neither one of those categories are more or less static in whatever water quality they're in. They're not getting better or worse. Is that correct?
Correct. They may not have a particular trend one way, a noticeable trend one way or the other.
Okay. So we can see that maybe a little less than 50%, somewhere near there, are good to excellent, but their directionality, so to speak, in trend does not appear to be significant.
Correct.
Commissioner Kyle.
So I found this graph kind of confusing, actually, because the water quality that is declining is is getting worse. So our impaired water bodies seem to be getting worse in recent years. So, but stepping back, are these the same sites? Is this like a repeated measure where these are the same sites being measured over and over again? Or is this just all the data that DEQ has in every year for different water bodies? Because like the trend and the patterns in this it's hard to interpret for giving, if this is meant to be the general public's easy, understandable graphic, it's hard to understand.
Commissioner Kyle, yes. So you had a few questions there. So the first question is in terms of the data that this represents. So 160 sites, DEQ maintains those sites. They are visited once every 2 months. They've been in more or less for the majority of those sites. Those have been static over a long period of time. I'd have to defer to Lori for exactly, but in the order of decades, we've been going to these same sites for a very long time. We've added some recently and expanded the network to some degree, but this is something that we have maintained over time. So this represents DEQ's data, not other entities' data. So there is some limitations in terms of what this represents and the broadness of the data. We also recognize that some of these metrics aren't the most insightful. To some degree, I think we acknowledge that there's probably some discussion that we need to have about are there ways in which this can be improved, in part because in some cases, if you actually have a water body that's in good or excellent condition, so long as it stays in good or excellent condition, we may not care so much if it's improving, for example. So there are some limitations in terms of exactly the level of insight that this can provide. And I'm going to talk about a couple of other ways that we are looking at water quality information that provide maybe a little bit more specific information, but also provide maybe a little bit more, depending on the question, may provide a little bit more helpful information. I'm going to preface all of this with saying that I think where we sit within the water quality program, I think that we have some opportunity to think about how we best use our capabilities that we've been building over the last couple of years to present information in a way that is maybe a little bit more digestible over time. And so we can, if that's still a topic that the commission would like to spend a little bit more time on and we have time for questions, we can maybe talk about that for a moment or two.
Okay, well, and at the risk of going a little bit too far down this direction, I just have to ask though, so are we to take it from this graphic that from about 87 to approximately 02 or 01, something like that, there were no water bodies with declining water quality? I mean, that would seem to be what this infers, but maybe again, that has to do with data sets.
And Chair George, that's a really good question, and I would need to follow up with our experts who are more familiar with the data and the trends over time and the reasons behind, or anything that we can attribute to what we see over time with these data sets to be able to answer that specific question.
Okay, I understand.
Okay, next slide, Stephanie. Okay, so the next couple of slides, I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about information that we have begun compiling in probably about the last 5 to 6 years. We have been producing what we're calling status and trends. And this effort really originated with conversations we were having, in particular with Department of Agriculture, about how we could best bring information into those conversations about where we are in terms of achieving standards, and in particular, a progress toward meeting TMDL load allocations. So we began working on what we call the status and trends report as we were interacting with Department of Agriculture in their biennial review process. And over time, we've developed the tools to be able to perform these analyses on a statewide basis. So what you see here, currently we're doing it for a key set of parameters that we frequently have data for, but are also the most common parameters that are addressed within total maximum daily loads, and are correlate to a lot of different practices and restoration efforts that are going on the ground, both in general restoration, but also to achieve TMDL allocations and water quality standards. So we recently published, like I said, we've developed now the tools to be able to do this in a more comprehensive way. And we recently published the culmination of that analysis on our website, where we have this information across the state. And so this last iteration has been working to tighten up the relationship between this effort with the work that we've been doing to improve the integrated report and our assessment of water quality. And so there's still more work to be done there, but this is beginning to get tighter in terms of its relationship there. So what we see here, just a couple things I'll note here is we evaluate for these particular pollutants, looking at whether or not the data within an assessment unit is achieving these particular water quality standards. In those cases, there's a couple of instances you'll see at the bottom of the chart for phosphorus and total suspended solids, where we don't necessarily, in many cases, have a specific metric to measure them against. So we don't have numeric water quality standards or necessarily load allocations in a TMDL for phosphorus in all the places where we're collecting phosphorus data, for example. And so that shows up in the report as unassessed because we don't have a specific quantitative benchmark to compare it to. But what you are seeing, and this is really very consistent with what's in the integrated report, and the analyses are very similar. We're seeing about a third of waters where we have sufficient data that are achieving dissolved oxygen. The enterococcus is a bit irrelevant because that's only applicable to marine waters, so you can ignore that. This is largely a freshwater focused analysis, but we are seeing about 50% of the time E. coli is being attained, and on the flip side, about half the time it's not attaining water quality standards. pH is attaining most of the time. Temperature, we're seeing that there are still a significant number of waters that are not achieving temperature water quality standards. And then I'm going to turn you to the next slide, because I think this is really where we're seeing some of the benefits around the status and trends report, is our ability to take large data sets and look at where we're seeing trends. And this is really helpful. And what we've done is we've looked at a 20-year data set for these parameters and looked at where we have data in at least 8 years in the same month of the year, because some of these do have a seasonal component, where we've got 8 years worth of data. Are we seeing a trend one way or the other in terms of these specific pollutant parameters? So we can see for dissolved oxygen, we are seeing a fair number of locations where we have data that is drawing a trend that are improving. On the flip side, we are seeing a significant number of waters that are in a degrading trend for temperature. We are seeing, in terms of trends, improvements in phosphorus conditions, again, where we have that trend data, and improvements in E. coli as well. One thing I'll note, which may stand out to you, is for pH. pH is a little bit funky, because pH, too high a pH is bad and too low of pH is bad. So the algorithms here to figure out whether or not we have an improving or a declining trend are a little bit difficult, particularly when you are actually already attaining. We do see some pretty high percentages of locations where we are already achieving pH, so that the trends here have to dig a little bit further on the pH to really be able to tease out what the stories are there. In terms of what this is telling us, we've not done a deep dive analysis of these results, but a couple things that we can derive from this information is that in some cases we do know that based on some other literature, and this data is consistent with that in West Coast streams, we are generally seeing increases in the temperatures of rivers and streams in West Coast streams that correlate with climate change. At the same time, we are also seeing in certain areas of the state significant efforts around stream channel and riparian restoration. And we are also seeing areas where stream flow is changing. And in some cases that's changing for the better because, there are efforts, broad scale efforts to look at irrigation efficiencies and things like that that will help relieve flow in the stream. But we also know that due to climate change, stream flows are also changing in a negative way and changing in times of year in which they flow due to snowpack, things like that. We also are also seeing probably here too, when we're looking at some of these trends, there are some natural year-to-year variations that may be showing up here as well. So it is a little bit difficult to tease out exactly what all of these are attributable to, but I would say, we think it is a fair conclusion that some of the degrading trends that we're seeing in temperature probably by and large are associated with climate change. We are also seeing when we do use these and have been having conversations on the more local scale, for example, when we are engaging with Department of Agriculture and other designated management agencies through various TMDL review efforts, we are seeing a number of more smaller scale stories that we're able to tell from this information that are showing improvements that correlate to specific on the ground efforts in local watershed scales. Some other places where if we're seeing kind of a mixture of data results, we were able to correlate those to things that are happening or haven't been successful in getting on the ground implementation, and are being able to bring this type of objective information into those conversations about where further emphasis needs to be placed on restoration and TMDL implementation activities. So I'm going to pause there for a minute to see if there's any questions on that before I move to the next metric.
Commissioner Addington.
Thank you. Hey, Jennifer, I'm trying to I'm kind of struggling with this information. And if I'm looking, well, at all of the tables, but then the chart on slide 17, I guess I'm sure it goes back to what Director Whitman said when it's, this is complicated, right? It's not easy to just tease it all out, but I guess my question is, if we go back in time, if we go back to this 1981 time versus where we're at now, have the standards or the metrics changed at all over that time? And what about the technology? Are we measuring the same way we measured back then? Are we finding more stuff that we didn't know about back then? How do I think about that?
Commissioner Addington, those are really good questions. So a couple of things. So in terms of the metrics, the temperature metrics that let me go back even a step further. So when we calculate the index, there's two things to note about the index. One is that the metrics that we use aren't based on water quality standards, and it's based on grab sample data. So there are limitations in what these results tell us, and they're kind of aggregated in a way that gives us kind of it's not a fine scale, it is a coarse scale type of insight for the index. To your question about within the rest of the water quality program, the metrics that we use, the temperature water quality standards have been in place in the form that they're in now since about 2003. So that's been fairly constant. The metrics that we used prior to that were very similar. So I don't know that we would get a significantly different result in terms of how we measured temperature from about 96 to where we are today. That's been a pretty constant metric. Dissolved oxygen, similarly, we've been in about the same place since about the mid 90s to where we are today in terms of how we measure dissolved oxygen, and these other parameters are also very similar over time. To the second part of your question, which is a really good one and a really important one, is how we measure these types of data. What we know, particularly for parameters like temperature and dissolved oxygen, and to some degree pH, those values have significant variability, not just from season to season, month to month, year to year, but also diurnally. So when you collect that information and what time of day that you're collecting it is really important to being able to understand what's happening at a site. That's why when we are doing any kind of data related to our water quality standards for temperature, for example, we only use continuous data because that temperature grab sample data simply isn't very useful in understanding how we're achieving water quality standards. And we're moving more and more and placing a greater degree of information that it's giving us for continuous data as it relates to dissolved oxygen as well, because of that basically daily variability that we can see with a dissolved oxygen sampling. Those are more expensive than going out and taking a grab sample, but they provide us a lot more insight. And so I will say that that's been kind of a gradual increase over time in terms of how we incorporate that kind of data into our regulatory framework. So whether it's the integrated report, water quality standards, TMDL development, we rely more and more on that continuous data over time. And because now we do have the data infrastructure to be able to actually hold, as you can imagine, continuous data where you're getting readings every 15 minutes, that's where we end up with millions and millions of data point. Having the data infrastructure to be able to handle and analyze that data is something that we've really only developed in the last several years to be able to do in a efficient way.
Thank you.
Okay, please continue.
Okay, next slide, please, Stephanie. Okay, sorry, I'm catching up with my information here. Okay, so this slide gives us some information about how, what we know about toxic pollutants in Oregon's waters. What we have here on the left side, those pie charts indicate how frequently we have data to assess for toxic pollutants. Those types of parameters are more difficult to monitor for, in some cases requiring fairly specialized monitoring protocols or sampling protocols themselves, and then the analytical chemistry on that is also more difficult or a little bit more expensive and resource intensive to be able to analyze. So we find that even when we pull in data, not just EQ's data, but other entities' data, we just don't have as much toxics data as we do for the other more conventional stream measurement parameters. And so what we have here is we've broken it down in the water quality program. We have two different types of toxics. We're looking at both human health endpoints through consumption of drinking water and consumption of fish. And we're also looking at how toxic pollutants can affect the aquatic life health, so fish, invertebrates, other types of organisms. And so we have about 140 different parameters that are associated with human health endpoints, and where we have about 35 to 40 parameters that are focused on aquatic life toxicity endpoints. In both cases, you'll see that throughout the state, we're able to look at data. We only have toxics data about 8 to 9% of the time, depending on the pollutants that we're looking at. So not super often do we actually have the data to look at. Where we do have the data to look at, you'll see on the right side, where we do have data to evaluate, we are finding that the portion of the water body that we're looking at is impaired about a third of the time for one or more of those pollutant parameters. So I'll pause and see if there's any questions about that before I move on to the last slide in this part of the presentation.
Doesn't look like it. Go ahead.
Okay. All right, and lastly, I wanted to spend a couple of minutes talking about a function that our laboratory has picked up in the last couple of years, monitoring for cyanotoxins. This monitoring program was started in 2018 as part of an emergency rulemaking that followed the Salem water source cyanotoxin issue and subsequent shutdown of the drinking water system. As a result of those rules, 56 facilities, drinking water facilities, are now required to participate in drinking water cyanotoxin monitoring. Those facilities are, you can just see the distribution of those in the inset map there. So some on the coast, largely the Willamette Valley, is where those facilities are located. They're required to take samples of their source waters every 2 weeks from May through October. Our laboratory has been processing all of those samples. If they have a sample that exceeds an action level, so not a human health level, but basically it's a level that prompts additional monitoring. If they hit above that threshold, then they're required to do weekly monitoring of their source water and also take a finished water post-treatment sample and have that analyzed to ensure to be able to gauge whether or not there are cyanotoxins that are making it through the drinking water system at levels of concern that would necessitate some subsequent human health actions. So what we have here is just showing you what we're seeing, or what we've seen so far, based on basically 2 seasons of doing this monitoring. So you'll see we've tried to array this both temporally along the bottom. You'll see months of the year there. So for the city of Gates, Staten, Jefferson, Lyons, Mahama, city of Salem, and Josephine County Parks, those were the drinking water systems who had levels in their source waters above the action level in 2019. And you can see for most of those, and they're kind of in the mid-Willamette Valley Basin, those occurred midsummer. We didn't have any of those facilities actually exceeding levels of concern in their finished treated drinking water. So that's important to note also. You'll see, interestingly, in the Southern Oregon, late going into fall, we did have some elevated levels in source water in Josephine County Parks source of drinking water in late 2019. In 2020, the only place where we saw an exceedance of an action level was in Ashland, and that was actually fairly recent. Ashland's in process of sampling their source water and also their finished water. But as of like 2 days ago, when I talked with Lori Pillsbury, due to fire and transportation and all kinds of issues, we had not received and had the opportunity to process those additional samples yet. So we're not quite sure where that's where that story is leading with the city of Ashland. But so far, of all of the 56 facilities, these are the handful of situations where we have had levels of concern, but important to note that none of those levels have resulted in any additional issues for the delivery of safe drinking water in those communities. And so with that, that wraps up the slides that I had related to water quality metrics. So if we've got a few moments, or if there's any additional questions, we can take those before I turn it over to Abby Baduras for the quality slides.
Commissioner Barrasso.
This is hopefully a quick question. If you go back a few slides, back to the one where you had the overlap over the 10-year period, sort of the slide where you have you're monitoring for 10-year period, you're indicating trends. Next slide, one direction or the other. It's a bar chart.
I think that might be the first one, Stephanie.
Yeah, this one. Yeah, there we go. If you're looking at 10-year periods here, could you just say, were there certain events that shifted? You know, I see a big period in green and then I see a big period in red, and maybe it's my misunderstanding of this chart, but were there events that happened, or periods where we started collecting a lot more data that results in, you know, going from increasing trends, but then all of a sudden the next 10-year period, which still overlaps with the previous 10-year period, has that switch? So I just don't understand, given there's overlapping those 10-year periods, I expect those trends to be more smooth.
I will take a run at it, and I will also invite Director Whitman to add anything as well. So Vice Chair Barrasso, a couple of important, I would say, inflection points in water quality regulatory history, perhaps. What we see in that very early timeframes in the early 80s, that's where you're seeing massive construction grant, wastewater treatment infrastructure, huge investments occurring in terms of water treatment across the board. And so I would say that probably in some of those areas where you see those initial increasing and improving trends. Now, the water quality may have still been not great. We are still only seeing, less than 30% in some of those cases where the water quality was actually good. So there's a lot of opportunity for improvement at that point in time. And there was a lot of investment in that infrastructure. I would say another important inflection point would have come in the late 90s, early 2000s. That is also when a lot of activity was occurring on the state level, as well as on the national level, and a focus on non-point source investment and regulation and statutory frameworks that resulted in some additional attention being paid to the need for additional investment in riparian restoration. Also, that Director Whitman's gonna have to help me. The salmon recovery plans. There's a lot of things happening in that late 90s, mid 90s to late 90s timeframe that I would also attribute to a lot of additional emphasis being placed on looking at water quality, need to restore riparian areas and things like that, where there was an uptick in declining, but then you see that starting to go down and the green bars starting to go back up as well.
Well, if I could, Chair George, just to add to that. So this is the advantage of being old, one of the few advantages. The Oregon Forest Practices Act went into effect in 1987, if I remember correctly, 87, 89 period. So you had the initial set of rules in terms of riparian protections on forest lands, on non-federal forest lands. And then maybe even more important, on federal forest lands, you had, of course, the significant changes in federal forest management coming out of the spotted owl issues in the late 80s, early 90s also. So those probably, remember, a lot of the sites here where you're seeing improving trends, maybe sites where water quality is already relatively good and it's getting better, which would tend to be the case in those higher elevation forest sites. Another factor coming a little bit later would be the beginning of the Agricultural Water Quality Management Program with ODA, Oregon Department of Agriculture, which was in mid to late 90s. When those rules were developed and adopted, the area plans and rules. NRCS, also Federal Natural Resource Conservation Service, has become much more active over the years. So I think those are probably big drivers, and you probably see a fair amount of effect from those changes during that initial period of green, higher green bars on the chart. And then the incremental effect of those programs kind of levels off. And so, and that shows where we've been since then. That would be my unscientific but historic perspective.
Thank you.
Any other comments or questions on this section? All right, let's continue.
Okay.
Oh, great.
So thank you, Jennifer. And now we're going to hear from Abby Baderas on safe and productive lands and sustainable use of materials. And again, Abby's sitting in for Lydia Emer, who's out on medical leave for a little bit here. So thank you, Abby, for taking this on.
Well, thank you. Someone give me a thumbs up if you can hear me all right. Thank you. Well, thank you, Chair George, Director Whitman, and members of the Commission. I am Abby Baduris, Legislative Analyst for the Land Quality Division, as you said, you heard, filling in for Lydia today. I'll do my best. This is her presentation, though, and credit goes to her as well. Land quality, as a reminder, is a coordinated group of programs encompassing materials management, emergency response, environmental cleanup, underground storage tanks, and hazardous waste. These activities all touch upon all environmental media, air, water, and land, with the goal of protecting our communities and the environment from hazardous pollution and the negative impacts of materials. Today, I will briefly share a couple of the key environmental outcome measures, and different from air and water, they are quite specific to the specific programs. Next slide, please. The Environmental Cleanup Program, it identifies, investigates, and remediates sites where hazardous substance contamination is confirmed or suspected. Sites here include properties in which the presence or potential presence of a hazardous substance, pollutant, or contaminant can complicate expansion, redevelopment, or reuse of the property. Cleaning up and reinvesting in these properties provides many benefits. They provide safer places for people to live, work, and play, increase local tax bases, facilitate job growth, utilize the existing infrastructure, reduce development pressures on undeveloped land, all while improving and protecting the environment. This measure that you see shows the cleanups completed per year. Many of these sites come to DEQ through the voluntary cleanup program, where a property owner requests agency oversight with the goal of a no further action, or NFA, determination. These sites really range. They're from simple to very complex sites, and they rely on cost recovery for the agency to recoup our costs. Next slide. Switching now to materials management, our current key performance measure focuses, or KPM, focuses on traditional measures of waste. One of those measures is waste generation. That is the sum of what's in the whole solid waste system, recycling plus disposal, measured in tons. Our legislated goal is to reduce this. The graph shows how waste generation has really looked for the last decade or so. When the economy, and you can see that it tracks economic activity. When the economy is busy, there's more stuff being consumed, thrown away, and recycled. Generation was low during the recession in 2008 or so, and it has increased since then. We do expect to see increase in 2020 when we get that data as a result to the effects of COVID-19 on the economy. Next slide. The other materials management key performance measure is the recovery rate. Recovery rate is a percentage. It's the weight in the recycling and compost bins divided by the total weight in the waste stream. Our legislative goal is to increase this number. This graph that you see shows how changes in the recovery rate and how they've been affected by marketplace changes in the recycling system, such as the constriction of foreign markets in Asia that I've come before and talked to you guys about over the last year or so. Addressing those issues in the recycling system is a significant effort for DEQ in 2020. We formed the Recycling Steering Committee in 2018 to recommend ways to modernize Oregon's recycling system and to ensure it's more resilient and effective in the future in years to come. The committee, I'm pleased to say, is going to hold its final meeting tomorrow. And I look forward to updating you in a future commission meetings about where we're going with that. Thank you for the applause, Director.
Yeah, that is exciting news. Do we have that on a future agenda at this time? Because I know that several of our commissioners are very interested in this work.
We can work on that, I'm sure.
Great. Let's follow up with Stephanie and we'll find a good place for it. Thanks, Abby.
Great, look forward to that. So next slide, please. So these traditional measures that I just spoke about of waste generation and recovery are helpful, but they don't tell the whole story about the impacts of materials, because they focus on solid waste or materials that have been used up or consumed or discarded. A lot of materials don't make it into the waste stream, like food that gets eaten or concrete that goes into a building. And a lot of the environmental impacts associated with those materials are generated before they enter the waste stream during their production. If you would click ahead, Stephanie, you can see the rest of the impacts there. Thank you. So just as important as the measures I shared, our measures must be able to show successes in all the possible ways of changing the impacts of materials, not just recycling, but also strategies like reuse and repair, product redesign, government procurement, and material switching. So that's what we have for you today. Thank you. If there's any questions.
Do we have any questions on Abby's portion of the presentation? Well, I think maybe anticipating that we're going to get to talk about this in a little bit more detail soon. I'm not seeing any, but thank you very much, Abby.
Thank you.
All right, Director, is there any last words on this item?
Thanks, Chair George and Commissioners. I know we're running late on this, so the only thing I'm going to say is thank you for the questions and comments today. I think this is the opening of a longer conversation about this work and how we report it to you and the general public that I look forward to having here over the coming months. So thanks. And thanks to all the staff who worked putting this together. A lot of hard work behind the scenes to get this together.
Absolutely. I think that these are going to be some very useful benchmarks and a useful work product. So thanks to everybody for that. Okay, just in the name of human charity here, I think we probably do need at least a brief break. It is now 2:54, so we are a bit behind schedule, but that's all right. We'll be efficient in our upcoming agenda items. So can we meet back at 3:05? Does that work for everyone? All right, 3:05. See you here. Thanks very much. Perfect. All right, I'm taking a look. I think our other commissioners might still be away. We will get underway shortly. And are our staff presenters, Loretta and Michael, available? We know we just saw Abby. Welcome.
Yes, I'm available.
Wonderful. And Loretta, are you ready?
Yes, I am. Thank you.
Wonderful. Well, welcome and welcome back, everyone. We'll turn the floor over to you for the Drug Take Back Program rules. This is a rulemaking action. Go ahead.
Thank you, Chair George and Commissioners. My name is Loretta Pickerel, and I'm a manager for the Materials Management Program in DEQ's Land Quality Division. With me is Michael Lee, a Product Stewardship Specialist for Materials Management. Michael was our program's lead in helping develop the drug take-back legislation, and he's now project lead for startup and implementation of the new drug take-back program. The drug take-back law was passed in 2019, 12 years after the Oregon Pharmaceutical Take-Back Stakeholder Group's recommendation was first presented to the EQC. Over the years, we have provided updates to the EQC and are thrilled to be providing this presentation. It marks a huge milestone as we move from concepts through authorization to rules, allowing us to serve Oregon's communities. Today, we are recommending the Commission adopt proposed rules that will help ensure the success of this new drug take-back program. The proposed rules will support enforcement, help ensure access to program services for minority, low-income, rural, and other historically underserved communities, and establish fees to cover DEQ's costs for administering the program. The drug take-back program will be DEQ's third product stewardship program, joining our paint and electronics recycling efforts. The goal of the program is to ensure that people in Oregon have a safe, secure, and convenient way to dispose of their unwanted and unused drugs across the state. The drug take-back program takes unwanted drugs out of medicine cabinets, reducing the opportunity for misuse of prescription painkillers, and keeps them from polluting our waters. Additionally, we see a critical opportunity to ground this program on a strong equity foundation. Among the proposed rules, we propose to clarify that drop-off sites must provide reasonably convenient and equitable access for minority, lower-income, rural, and other historically underserved communities. The proposed rules also require program operators to develop a goal to raise awareness about their drug take-back programs among these communities. In addition, we plan to convene a small stakeholder group to discuss implementation issues, including how to generate interest in underserved areas for authorized collectors to participate in our drug take-back program. Next slide, please. I will give you a brief overview of the new drug take-back program and how it will operate. Michael will then provide more detail about the services drug take-back programs must provide and DEQ's role, and will summarize the proposed rules and recommend their adoption. We welcome questions as we proceed through the presentation, so please feel free to stop us at any time. If a particular question will be addressed later in the presentation, we may defer the question until we reach that point. Before I begin, I want to talk a little bit about product stewardship. Product stewardship is the environmental strategy underpinning our electronics recycling, paint, and drug take-back programs. It's still a fairly new concept in Oregon and the US. Oregon's product stewardship programs focus primarily on management of unwanted products at the end of their useful life. Under these programs, the producers of the products covered are responsible for funding and operating programs to collect and safely manage their unwanted products. Statutes set standards that programs must meet, but give producers flexibility to design systems and processes to meet those standards. DEQ's role is much narrower. We oversee the producers in the programs to ensure they are meeting required standards. Product stewardship programs differ from traditional government programs where the government provides the services to the public, and product stewardship programs often have several advantages. Producers typically have the greatest expertise and ability to understand the environmental and human health impacts across the life cycle of their products and to reduce those impacts. And with our take-back programs, producers assume the burden of disposal, which typically falls on the public and government, and share costs more equitably. Next slide, please. Here's how Oregon's new drug take-back product stewardship program will work. It's much like our e-cycles and paint stewardship programs. Manufacturers of drugs sold in Oregon must participate in a drug take-back program that offers safe collection and disposal of unwanted drugs in Oregon. The manufacturers may operate these programs, but more typically join drug take-back organizations that operate programs on their behalf. The program operators must be 501c3 organizations, and their programs must be funded by their participating manufacturers. The program operators, before beginning operations, must submit program plans for DEQ's approval. And we anticipate 1 or 2 program operators will submit plans to operate drug take-back programs in Oregon. Under those plans, programs must provide free and convenient collection of unwanted drugs to all residents. And that includes a statewide network of drop-off sites, typically pharmacies and law enforcement agencies for in-person disposal, and mail-back service with prepaid envelopes upon request. The programs may also offer collection events. The programs may not impose a charge of any kind on persons using these services, and they must ensure that the collected drugs are disposed of in a hazardous waste facility or a municipal solid waste incinerator. And program operators typically contract with collectors, transporters, and disposal facilities to provide these services. The programs must also provide public outreach and education to increase public awareness of the program and of the importance of safe management of drugs. And they must pay fees to DEQ to cover its costs for administering the program. DEQ, in partnership with the Board of Pharmacy, will oversee the drug take-back programs to ensure they are implementing the law responsibly in compliance with their approved plans. The drug take-back law is fairly specific in setting out the requirements for drug take-back programs. The 4 rules we're proposing today clarify a few key requirements of the law and establish the fees as required to cover DEQ's administrative costs. I'll turn to Michael now to dive a bit deeper into the drug take-back law's requirements and the proposed rules.
Thank you, Loretta. Thank you, Chair George and Commissioners. For the record, my name is Michael Lee. I am a Product Stewardship Specialist for the Materials Management Program at DEQ. I want to go over in detail some aspects of the law that the proposed rules will touch or address upon to help put the rules in perspective. So first, in terms of timeline, as Loretta mentioned, a program operator must submit a program plan to DEQ describing how it will implement its plan. The statute requires that a plan be submitted by November 1st of 2020. DEQ will review the plan and approve or reject the plan with an opportunity for the program operator to submit a revised plan. Once a plan has been approved, a program must begin operations by July 1st, 2021. Next slide, please. The types of drugs that a drug take-back program must accept are fairly comprehensive. They include prescription drugs, over-the-counter drugs, brand name drugs, and generics. Certain types of drugs and other healthcare products are excluded from the program. I've given 3 examples here of supplements, exposed sharps, and animal medicines. Next slide, please. As mentioned, the law requires a program to establish a network of drop-off sites where people can dispose of drugs in secure receptacles. To establish a drop-off site, a program operator must contract with an authorized collector to host a receptacle at the authorized collector's location. Authorized collectors can be pharmacies or other DEA registrants that qualify federally to collect and dispose of controlled substances or to have their registration modified to do so. Authorized collectors can also be law enforcement agencies. So just to give an example of what might typically happen, a program operator will reach out to a pharmacy and see if there's interest in the pharmacy to host a secure receptacle in its store for drug take-back. The pharmacy will contact the program operator when the receptacle is full, and the program operator will send a vendor to empty the receptacle and transport the collected drugs for disposal. The actual process will be defined in agreements between the pharmacy and the program operator. So it will be up to the pharmacy to decide whether it wants to participate or not. Next slide, please. Unless permitted by DEQ otherwise, a program operator must find authorized collectors to host at least 1 drop-off site per county and additional sites for each population center, which is defined in statute as a city or town and the unincorporated county within 10 miles from the center of the city or town. The number of sites will depend on the city or town's population. Drop-off sites must be located throughout a population center to provide reasonably convenient and equitable access for all residents. Next slide, please. So while the law requires a robust network of drop-off sites, there are 2 instances where a program operator with DEQ's permission can offer mailback services or services and collection events in place of a required drop-off site. First, the program operator in its proposed plan can request DEQ to waive drop-off sites in a specific county. In its request, the program operator must describe how the program will provide mailback service that is convenient to all residents in that county. Second, if a program operator cannot establish or maintain a drop-off site required by its submitted plan, the program operator can request DEQ to approve additional services and events in place of this drop-off site. So just to give an example of when a program operator might need to request a waiver or approval, it's possible that a county or a population center may have a limited number of potential authorized collectors, and that none of them at this time want to host a drop-off site. In that case, the program operator still needs to provide convenient service in the affected area, and it must propose how to do so through mailback services or collection events. Next slide, please.
Just 1 second, Michael, just wanted to mention and this would be an interjurisdictional cooperation. But once the program is up and running, if it could be worthwhile having conversations with tribal governments who often run rural health clinics, and they might be willing partners in these areas. Worth considering. Thanks.
Thank you, Chair George. I appreciate that. And it's definitely something that we are, considering doing and in the midst of doing. And as Loretta mentioned, we're forming an implementation group, and that's one of the issues we'll touch upon. Next slide, please. So DEQ will provide administrative oversight to ensure that programs are being properly implemented and that manufacturers and program operators are fulfilling their responsibilities under the law. So DEQ's responsibilities include reviewing a program operator's plan changes, and reports for plan approval, for DEQ approval, sorry. And also monitoring program operators and drug manufacturers for compliance in partnership with the Board of Pharmacy. The Board of Pharmacy provides valued expertise on the safe and secure handling of collected drugs. The Board of Pharmacy will also inspect drop-off sites at retail drug outlets. So these are locations that the board routinely inspects for compliance with pharmacy laws already. Next slide, please. I would now like to summarize the proposed rules. DEQ is proposing that these rules be included in Oregon Administrative Rules, Chapter 340, Division 98, which currently houses our rules for electronics recycling. DEQ has proposed amendments to existing rules in Division 90 to accommodate this inclusion. DEQ is also proposing 4 new rules to support enforcement, ensure access for minority, low-income, rural, and other historically underserved communities, describe factors to be considered for granting waivers or approvals related to services and collection events in place of drop-off sites, and to establish fees to cover DEQ's costs of administering the program. Next slide, please. We discussed these rules as rule concepts with our rulemaking advisory committee in 2 meetings. The committee included representation from interested parties such as pharmaceutical manufacturers, pharmacies, including independent pharmacies, drug take-back programs, substance abuse prevention advocates, clean water protection interests, and the Board of Pharmacy. Next slide, please. Our first new proposed rule is intended to support compliance and enforcement. We are proposing a rule allowing DEQ to require a drug take-back plan or updated plan to include either the Board of Pharmacy issued registration number for each participating manufacturer or a statement that the manufacturer is not required to register with the board. The Board of Pharmacy requires manufacturers of drugs intended for sale, distribution, dispensing, or administration in Oregon to obtain a registration number from the board. With the proposed rule, DEQ can compare the list of registration numbers provided by program operators with the Board of Pharmacy's list of registered manufacturers. And that can be a first step in identifying manufacturers that are not participating in a drug take-back program, but may be required to. If Board of Pharmacy registration requirements change, or DEQ finds a more effective approach for identifying noncompliance, the rule allows DEQ to drop the requirement to provide registration numbers in the future. Next slide, please. Our proposed rules are also intended to ensure access to historically underserved communities. The drug take-back law requires drop-off sites to be located throughout a population center to provide reasonably convenient and equitable access to all residents. DEQ proposes to clarify that reasonably convenient and equitable access includes access for minority, lower income, rural, and other historically underserved communities. The drug take-back law also requires program operators to develop a goal for fostering full public awareness of the drug take-back program. DEQ proposes that the goal should include fostering public awareness in historically underserved communities. Next slide, please. Our next proposed rule relates to when a program operator request to provide services or events in place of a required drop-off site. As mentioned, a program operator can ask DEQ to waive drop-off sites in a particular county. A program operator can also ask DEQ to approve additional services and collection events in place of a drop-off site that the program operator is unable to establish or maintain. Under the proposed rule, where a program operator seeks a waiver or approval, DEQ will consider whether the program operator has demonstrated good faith efforts to establish a drop-off site, why a drop-off site cannot be established or maintained, how the proposed services or collection events will provide convenience in the affected county or population center, and engagement with historically underserved communities to ensure this, that the program operator has obtained concurrence by the appropriate local governments in the affected area with the proposed services or events, or explain why the program operator could not obtain concurrence despite good faith efforts, and a commitment to solicit authorized collectors annually in the affected county or population center. DEQ believes these factors will help demonstrate that the proposed services or events will provide convenience in the absence of a required drop-off site, and that it will encourage a program operator to make and continue to make good faith efforts to establish a required drop-off site. Next slide, please. The Drug Take-Back Law authorizes the Environmental Quality Commission to send notice to and impose penalties against manufacturers that fail to participate in a drug take-back program as required. The Commission can also send notice to and impose penalties against program operators and participating manufacturers where a program is out of compliance with the law. DEQ is proposing a rule whereby DEQ can send such notice and impose penalties on the Commission's behalf. Next slide, please. Finally, DEQ is proposing a rule to establish fees. The Drug Take-Back Law requires drug manufacturers to cover DEQ's costs for administering the program. DEQ must establish 3 fees reasonably calculated to cover its costs. These are a one-time fee for reviewing a program plan, an annual fee for expenses associated with the ongoing costs of administering the Drug Take-Back Law, and an hourly fee for any other work DEQ must do on behalf of a drug take-back program. DEQ is proposing a one-time plan review fee of $75,000. Operating a statewide drug take-back program is complex, and it is important to ensure that a plan describes the proposed program in sufficient detail for DEQ to determine that the program will meet the drug take-back law's requirements. And these include requirements for collection services, transportation, disposal, public outreach, and education. DEQ's proposed plan review fee is based on the timeframe for review set forth in statute, as well as DEQ's experience in reviewing plans for its paint stewardship program. Based on inquiries received, DEQ anticipates likely having 2 program operators submit program plans by November 1st. Our paint program has 1 program operator, just for context, while our electronics recycling program has 2. And in jurisdictions we are aware of with drug take-back programs, such as Washington State, we have seen only 1 approved program operator. For the annual fee, DEQ is proposing $345,000 for the first year, $210,000 for the second year, and $125,000 for year 3 onwards. As discussed with the Rulemaking Advisory Committee, the first year's annual fee is higher to include DEQ's startup costs in establishing the program. The reduction of fees in year 2 onwards also reflects DEQ's expectation that its oversight costs will decrease once the drug take-back programs are operating and have matured. Finally, DEQ is proposing that the hourly fee will not exceed $250 per hour. The statute requires drug manufacturers to cover DEQ's administrative costs for drug take-back. The hourly fee is intended to account for costs for other work not covered by the plan review fee or the annual fee. DEQ is proposing that it will invoice hourly fees on a quarterly basis and will calculate the hourly fee to reasonably reflect expenses for work performed. Next slide, please. So I'd like to give a little context for DEQ's proposed fees. DEQ's proposed fees are only a portion of a program operator's cost of operating and implementing a drug take-back program. In a recently approved drug take-back program plan for Washington State, the program operator estimated its annual operating costs at $4 million, and that includes administrative costs, contracts for collection, transportation, and disposal, and communication costs. If we assume operating costs of a drug take-back program in Oregon to be comparable, and that only one drug take-back program is approved in Oregon, DEQ's combined one-time plan review fee and first annual fee, or $420,000, would represent approximately 11% of a drug take-back program's annual operating cost. In year 2, the annual fee will be reduced to $210,000, or approximately 6% of the overall annual cost. In year 3 onwards, the proposed annual fee will be approximately 3%. And as I mentioned before, the cost of a program operator would be funded by its participating drug manufacturers. Next slide, please. DEQ's proposed fee rule has additional provisions to provide flexibility and allow DEQ to adjust the annual fee downward in a given year if costs are lower than anticipated. This adjustment mechanism is similar to what DEQ uses for its electronics recycling program fees. The additional provisions are: if multiple programs exist, DEQ will divide the annual fee equally among the program operators. DEQ can also reduce the annual fee in 2 ways if expected revenue exceeds projected costs. First, if revenue from the plan review fee and annual fee excludes DEQ's actual costs in a fiscal year, DEQ will reduce the annual fee by that excess in a subsequent year or years. Second, DEQ may reduce the annual fee for a fiscal year to ensure revenue approximately matches projected costs for that year. Finally, DEQ will publish its current and projected program expenditures and revenue for each fiscal year. This is not required by statute, but something DEQ has committed to doing to provide transparency. Next slide, please. Thank you for the opportunity to present these proposed rules. In closing, DEQ recommends that the Environmental Quality Commission adopt the proposed rules and rule amendments as seen in Attachment A of the staff report for this item as part of Chapter 340 of the Oregon Administrative Rules, Division 98.
Thank you very much. Commissioner Mosby?
Yeah, Michael, one question. The Board of Pharmacy has some role here, both with the registration and also oversight of the collection agencies. Are they going to get any funds, or how are they getting paid?
Commissioner, that's a good question. I believe that's something that we will discuss with them further. We are supposed to enter into an interagency agreement with them for them to conduct inspections.
Yes, Commissioner Addington.
Thank you. Michael, I want to make sure I understand the fees, again, the annual fees. Are those, is that per manufacturer, or is that the total required and all the manufacturers contribute to that annual fee?
Thank you, Commissioner. It would be the total required, so that would reflect sort of DEQ's annual costs, and all manufacturers would sort of participate to contribute to paying that fee. So it's not each manufacturer having to pay that amount.
Okay, and then I just was curious why the program might not include animal medicine. I know many of the manufacturers, they're the same manufacturers, a lot of the same drugs. Just curious about that.
Sure, thank you, Commissioner. And that's a good question. That was just something that was defined in statute as excluded as a covered drug. So I think that was just something negotiated.
Thank you.
I think it's a good point, though, Commissioner Addington. As you say, in many cases, the drugs are actually the same. So it could be an opportunity for growth in the program once established. All right. Any other questions and comments for our staff? All right, hearing none. This is an action item, so I would entertain a motion to proceed with the recommended language.
So this is Commissioner Kyle for the record. I would recommend that DEQ recommends that the environmental quality, actually that's the recommendation, sorry, let me pull up the statute language. I move that the commission adopt the proposed rule amendments as seen on page 39 through 42 of this report as part of chapter 340 of the Oregon Administrative Rules.
We hear a second.
Second.
Do we require any further discussion, commissioners? Hearing none, those in favor signify by saying aye.
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 Those opposed signify with same sign. Any abstaining? The motion carries. Thank you very much for your presentation.
Thank you so much, commissioners.
Chair George.
Yes, Director.
Thank you, Chair George. Before everybody leaves us today, first of all, I want to thank Loretta and Michael for the presentation. And I believe Deputy Director Feldon would like to say a few words here.
Yes, thank you, Director Whitman, and thank you, Chair George and commissioners. Before we let Loretta and Michael go, I do want to take a brief moment to recognize Loretta. Lydia Emer, our land quality administrator, had wished to deliver these remarks, and I'm honored to deliver them for her. So Loretta Pickerel, our materials management program manager at DEQ since 2005, is retiring at the end of this month. She began her career as an EPA attorney and went on to lead Utah's efforts to prevent siting of a high-level nuclear waste repository near Canyonlands and established Utah's environmental cleanup program. Loretta joined DEQ in 1988 to help launch Oregon's environmental cleanup program. She moved to the governor's office to work on natural resource policy issues, and then on to work with nonprofits on sustainability projects before returning to DEQ in 2000. During her 25 years at DEQ, she's worked in the air, water, cleanup, enforcement, and materials management programs. The materials management program has accomplished much under Loretta's leadership. Highlights include passage and implementation of the Oregon e-cycles, paint, and now drug take-back product stewardship programs, adoption of beneficial use rules, development of Oregon's consumption-based greenhouse gas emissions inventory, implementation of a green building program, and launching the steering committee process to modernize Oregon's recycling system. Most significantly, the program developed the 2050 vision for materials management in Oregon and legislation and rules to provide staff, funding, and authorities to robustly implement the vision. The program expanded and launched new initiatives to reduce impacts from production and consumption, preventing wasting of food, promoting sustainable purchasing, expand reuse and repair, expand grants, conduct and expand uses of life cycle assessments, and develop new goals and tools to support them. The program has completed dozens of studies and reports that have provided critical science-based foundation and understanding to advance the field of sustainable materials management. The program has cemented DEQ's position as a groundbreaking leader in the materials management space. Loretta is leaving behind a reputation for thinking strategically, for untangling thorny policy and legal issues, and for synthesizing complex information into succinct concepts and briefing papers, of which I've benefited from many. She's spent many long nights making sure the information needed to move forward was ready for the next stakeholder meeting, the next briefing, the next response to the legislature. Loretta will be sorely missed at DEQ, and we wish her an enjoyable retirement. In addition to playing with grandkids, she looks forward to windsurfing, kayaking, skiing, cycling, gardening, reading, making music, and enjoying family and friends. and exploring new opportunities to help build the cultural capacity to live well within the limits of our ecosphere. So I want to thank Loretta for your profound contributions to Oregon's environmental quality. So with that, I'll turn it back to you, Chair George.
Wonderful. Thank you for that beautiful tribute, Leah. Loretta, thank you. Thank you on behalf of grateful citizens. We know that we owe so much to dedicated public servants like yourself. So thank you for a long and productive and successful career, and enjoy. It sounds like you're going to be as busy in your retirement as you have been in your career. So thank you. Thank you. And we wish you the very best in enjoying the next chapters.
Thank you, Chair George, Deputy Director Leah, and Director Richard. I truly appreciate the thoughts, and I've had a wonderful career here with great people and great opportunities. So thank you very much.
Loretta, you've done so much for Oregon and all the people and the ecosystem that we all depend on. Just can't thank you enough. We really are going to miss you. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thanks again, Loretta. Be well and enjoy. All right. Well, after sending Loretta off in style and completing that chapter for work, that's a wonderful way to finish up. All right. Well, we had better move ahead nonetheless. We have the Informational Air Quality Division core work update. So we will welcome back Ali. And it looks like you might have at least a couple of folks who might help you with this presentation.
I do. I always have need my lifelines, and I do have them for this presentation as well. Good afternoon, Chair George, Commissioners. Again, for the record, I'm Ali Mirzakhalili, Air Quality Division Administrators. I'm here today with Jacqueline Palermo, Air Operations Section Manager. And we're here to discuss the Air Quality Program's core work, as well as recent process improvements and projects. So go to the next slide, please. So air permitting can be grouped into three main categories. ACDPs, which are state-level permits issued for facilities to construct and operate. These permits apply to small estimators that are regulated, as well as some of the largest facilities that have requested emission limits to stay out of federal Title V permitting. These permits regulate criteria pollutants, federally defined hazardous air pollutants, and greenhouse gas emissions. Title V permits are federal permits that are for major sources that allow only operation of the facility, not construction. These permits also regulate criteria pollutants, federally defined hazardous air pollutants, and greenhouse gas emissions. And lastly, Clean Air Oregon requirements, which establish health and risk-based limitations that are incorporated into an existing ACDP or Title V permit. This portion of air permitting addresses risks from several hundred more air toxics than 187 federally defined HAPs. And this is the rule that you all approved back in 2018. By law, every facility subject to permitting requires at least an ACDP before construction can begin, and most permits are required to have all applicable air quality rules and regulations included. This involves a variety of emission limits, operation and maintenance requirements, monitoring, record keeping, reporting, testing, and compliance demonstrations. For example, one permit may have an array of reporting requirements that include emissions when they occur, monthly, quarterly, semi-annual, annual emission or production data, greenhouse gases, and notification for specific activities. The arrows on this slide indicate that an ACDP facility can become a Title V if a source increases emissions above specific thresholds or conducts specific activities which per our requirements require a Title V permit. Clean Air Oregon applies to ACDP and Title V facilities when it is incorporated into permits upon a new construction, or when a facility is notified by DEQ that is required to begin risk assessment process. So when we get called in to the program. Both ACDP and Title V permits are living documents in that the facility can decide at any point that they want to modify or alter their permits with new equipment or processes that require permit changes, and the permit may also need to be modified to include new or updated rules, or alternatively, when it reaches its scheduled expiration date. Next one, please. So an air permit begins its life cycle with when a facility submits an application. Typically, the permit writer will have a number of conversations to obtain additional information and clarification. Then, when the application is complete, staff will look to have the permit issued within the timelines targets that are shown here. Each permit will be issued for several years and have a compliance inspection every few years as well, as is shown here in the chart. As the permit approaches the expiration date, the applicant must submit a renewal application. At this time, they may notify the EQ of corrections, clarifications, new equipment plans, or anything else. For permittees that submit their applications on time before their permit expires, the permit is considered extended until DEQ finishes the permit action. This means the facility can comply with the expired permit while DEQ works on the renewal. This expired but extended permit is a backlog permit. Because the source with expired permit may still operate, a new facility or construction project that requires DEQ approval before initiating construction is typically prioritized. These new and construction projects over time and in conjunction with fewer overall staff result in more permits being placed into backlog status. Inspections are a critical core function of the permit program, and understaffing can result in inspection and not being done in a timely manner. Inspections are a proven compliance tool, and lack of inspections increase the chance that violations go undetected, as cited in the Secretary of State audit, which we'll cover later. While some facilities self-report violations, it is often the case that an in-depth, thorough review of facility operations and records by an inspector is the most effective way to assess compliance. Permitting staff time is committed to a variety of core work on a continual basis throughout the permit cycle, as indicated by boxes across the bottom of the slide. During the course of a typical permit issuance and renewal, permit writers will calculate emissions or verify emission calculations, communicate about potential or planned construction projects, review compliance reports, provide technical assistance, and respond to environmental complaints. While some instances of this work may be relatively quick, it can also be highly technical, time-consuming, and evolve into larger policy questions or technical debates or require significant additional research. Next slide, please. So backlog permits take longer to process because by the time they are ready to be worked on, there are many more changes that must be incorporated. This can mean revisions throughout the permit and sometimes a complete rewrite. Backlog permits create a risk to the environment, the community, and the facility. Facilities with permits expect to be in compliance with all applicable environmental law if they comply with their permit. When permits are continually extended or backlogged, the facility is expected to comply with their extended permit as well as any new federal or state requirements that may have been established or modified that aren't yet included in the permit. This creates regulatory uncertainty for the facility and can result in enforcement complications. Occasionally, project approvals are issued via permit attachments. The facilities provided them updated condition that addresses the requested change and not an entirely new updated permit. Over time, this can mean a facility has a base permit and several attachments that override permit conditions, and this makes a permit more complicated to understand and to comply with. The EQ also strives to remain equitable to ensure a level playing field by holding all facilities to the same standards, and a permit backlog reduces the EQ's ability to meet this goal. Additionally, EPA regularly updates their air toxic standards, for instance. and the DEQ implements new requirements that may be established. Existing requirements may be clarified, or rules may include new language to address legal actions that have come through the courts. All of the changes DEQ looks to implement are expected to have a positive result for the community and the environment, but that only happens if the backlog is reduced so the updates can be incorporated into the permits in a timely manner. DEQ has identified the permit backlog as a priority for several reasons. Some of them I mentioned. The impacts of a permit backlog extend past DEQ to permittees themselves, the community, and the environment. When there is a significant permit backlog, DEQ is not meeting core work deliverables that permittees expect. It results in some amount of rework on each permit, and the agency is not meeting the expectations of the public at large. Based on conversation with stakeholders, one of the things that permittees expect is to have timely permits. This helps facilities plan and act accordingly. DEQ has made improvements to permit templates to help permit writers more effectively write permits, and this also provides facilities a permit that is more clearly organized, easier to read, and easier to interpret. From the community or public at large, backlogs can result in lost confidence that the DEQ is adequately meeting its mission, and the emission analysis or applicable provisions are delayed until the permit is worked on again. Additionally, the public only gets a chance to comment and provide input at the initial issuance and renewal times. So backlog permits represent lost opportunity for public to participate. Next slide, please. So air quality is core work, and the amount of time staff spend on any given facility or permit is affected by a number of variables. The component that has become more prevalent over the last few years is the public process associated with permit issuance. As communities and public in general have become more interested in air toxics, emissions, industries, and the permitting process, DEQ has noticed an increase in public participation with public comment period and public hearings. While increased public interest in air quality permitting process is very encouraging and welcome, it has shined the light on the need for DEQ to provide efficient ways for communities to participate in the process and voice their concerns. In some instances, DEQ has received hundreds or thousands of public comment that cannot be addressed in the permitting action. This could be a land use issue outside of DEQ's authority or regulations that the commenters feel are too lenient. In these instances, permit writers and staff spend significant time reviewing and responding to comments covering issues that are not either within DEQ's authority or it can't be addressed within the particular permit action. Combined with DEQ's increased efforts and dedication to environmental justice, equity, and meaningful public participation, public and stakeholder engagement, the public process has become a significant variable in the amount of time it takes to finalize a permit. Another important aspect of permitting time revolves around DEQ staff familiarity with the applicable regulations and industry or operation type. With hundreds of federal regulations and accompanied by state-specific rules that may apply to any given facility, no permit writer is an expert in all of them. While we are continually updating our resources available for permit writers, staff will often need to discuss operations with the facility in detail, research potential applicability of many additional regulations, and methodically determine what must be included in the permit. Along the same lines, it is the knowledge base of the facility when it comes to environmental regulations. Some facilities may require significantly more communication and assistance to understand their requirements. Inspections may reveal that all required records exist, but may take a significant amount of time to produce and subsequently sort through and review. In some instances, one facility inspection can take 2 to 3 days. Some facilities that do not have dedicated environmental staff or consultants may be dependent on DEQ's permit or technical assistant time to best understand their requirements. The complexity and number of applicable regulations are also one of the factors in the time required to write a permit. As a facility subject to several different federal regulations can take time-intensive review, research, and communication to accomplish. The permit writers will navigate the regulations, determine applicability of each part of each regulation, and establish these requirements within the permit in the form of explicit permit conditions. For each applicable requirement, the permit writer must determine what ancillary permit conditions are necessary. For example, if a piece of equipment must meet certain emission standards, the permit writer must then establish the other permit conditions necessary to appropriately regulate the source. How will the facility demonstrate compliance? Is continuous or periodic verification required? What does the facility have to monitor? Direct specific pollutants or an indicator of compliance like pressure, flow rate, temperature, etc. What records are required to be retained in to sufficiently determine compliance during the inspection or through record keeping? While this process is inherently time consuming, it allows the EQ to produce a permit that is much simpler for a facility to understand and comply with. When a permit is in backlog, when a permit in backlog is being addressed by a permit writer, the staff will need to review the entire permit for changes in federal and state regulations, as well as any new interpretation, guidance, or legal changes since the permit was last revised or reviewed. Often this can be classified as rework. As such, it is in the interest of efficiency across the board to ensure the backlog remains as small as possible. Next slide, please. So I'd like to provide more detail regarding the complexity of applicable regulations from the previous slide and how this can impact the pace of permit issuance. Generally, as facilities and regulations increase in complexity, the higher the level of staff and time is required for writing the permit. One of the program's main goals when writing a permit is to include conditions that effectively translate complex regulations into clear facility-specific conditions. This work is done to ensure that a permit is clear regarding what a facility must do to achieve and remain in compliance. Without this level of effort and clarity in permitting by DEQ, many facilities would likely require a consultant or dedicated environmental staff. For example, one of the most common sets of environmental regulation is a reciprocating internal combustion engine or RICE. These are typically diesel, gasoline, or natural gas-fired engine generator sets that are intended to provide power generation capacity and are prevalent across the state. For each individual engine at a facility, of which there may be many, DEQ must interpret at least one of 3 federal regulations that may be applicable. These federal regulations establish different requirements for almost all possible engine types and sizes. The permit writer will determine the emission capacity of the facility, determine the date that each engine was manufactured, the fuel type used, the size of engine, and then establish which of 10 separate engine use categories it fits into. With each of these decision points, there are an array of potential requirements that the permit writer must determine as applicable or not. Combined with the ancillary permit conditions and requirements that may apply at specific times or if the engine is used in a specific manner. The air quality program has highly technical and effective permit writers, but this type of time-consuming work associated with permitting is expected to remain as a norm. So the DEQ can continue to issue through thorough and clear permits. That being said, the program is committed to improving or otherwise expediting how some more common or more complex regulations are incorporated into permits, which is an ongoing effort. I'm now going to turn it over to Jacqueline and ask her to discuss the Secretary of State audit and EPA State Review Framework Plan. Jacqueline, are you on?
Yes, thank you, Ollie. Hello, Chair and Commissioners. For the record, I'm Jacqueline Palermo, the Air Quality Operations Section Manager. As a side note, after testing my connection earlier today, the video function breaks up my sound, so I'm going to keep the video function off, so I apologize for those difficulties. I'm here today to discuss the Air Quality Program's core work, permit program audits, and resulting recent process improvements and projects. The Secretary of State audit was conducted in 2017 and focused on air permitting backlog. DEQ welcomed the auditors and worked in conjunction with them to provide as much information as possible regarding the air permitting program. The audit provided 10 recommendations to DEQ. The next slide will cover them in more detail, but the overall topics addressed within the recommendations are: workload for current staff is unbalanced, permit and inspections aren't completely timely, and that DEQ needs to improve the tools and resources for applicants and staff. With an understaffed permitting program, the agency is left making difficult decisions regarding priority work and finding ways to ensure less staff can conduct core work associated with more facilities. Next slide, please. These are the 10 items the audit cited and provided recommendations to DEQ. DEQ has taken steps in all of these areas, with the only major outstanding items being finding additional funding to align staff levels with current workload. DEQ's workload analysis conducted in response to the audit showed that at least 6 additional FTE were needed to realign. The post-audit analysis from the Secretary of State conducted a review of all 10 of the recommendations and cited the agency has fully implemented 5 and had taken significant steps to implement the other 5. As of today, the recommendations we don't consider resolved, but are expected to be further implemented include DEQ's rollout of the Environmental Database Management System, we call EDMS, for air quality. Additionally, there are inspection tracking and some process improvements that have been done for Title V permits that will also be incorporated into the ACDP program as well. Some examples of completed tasks include conducting lean process improvement in June of 2018, developing an intermediate inspection tracking tools to fill the data gap ahead of EDMS, issuing over 100 basic ACDPs to auto body shops in the Portland area, conducting major revisions to the ACDP templates, revising and reorganizing our external focused on the end user and easier navigation for the end user, overhauling the intranet page for permit writers. The resource pages included in the intranet have additional guidance documents, example permit conditions, regulatory interpretations, and historical rule changes, among others. Also, conducting a comprehensive air quality workload analysis and establishing the agency request budget for the 2019-2021 biennium. The policy option package 2016 that requested additional positions to align the workload analysis was also completed. We understand that the process improvement is always an ongoing effort. That being said, we are happy with the progress that has been made thus far and look forward to continued efficiencies to be gained from further efforts. Next slide, please. The second audit I'm here to discuss is the state review framework, which is called SRF for short. The SRF is a routine EPA audit that occurs approximately every 3 years. EPA Region 10 reviews permits, reports, inspections, enforcement actions, and supporting documents. The SRF report allows the EPA to identify recommendations and improvements within DEQ's permitting and inspection programs. The findings for air quality are grouped into 5 core categories, which is data, inspections, violations, enforcement, and penalties. Of these 5 categories that are audited, all but the penalties portion of the SRF are performed by our regional air quality staff, who conduct inspections as well as write the permits. The penalties portion of the SRS activities are performed by DEQ's Office of Compliance Enforcement, otherwise OCE. EPA found no suggested improvements in this area. DEQ received the final report on March 6, 2020. EPA found 4 of the 5 categories that need attention improvement, which are listed here. The SRF findings, the SRF findings echoed that of the Secretary of State audit. The SRF recommended improvements in terms of consistency, quality, and completeness of permitting and inspections. Although the improvements will be an ongoing effort overall, DEQ has implemented solutions to address all the issues identified. EPA has provided an update stating all the identified areas for improvement are considered resolved. Overall, the reduced staffing has created a tension between conducting high quality and thorough inspections and meeting inspection frequency targets. The same can be said for permitting. When issues like these are identified, it's important the air quality program to effectively address them. This is a balancing act of resources and time for planning, development, training, and implementation. Permitting staff assisting in the development of and learning how to use different forms and tools inherently slows down other identified priority work. While DEQ appreciates the feedback and all the opportunities to improve and streamline, it is important to ensure sufficient funding and staffing of the program so both process improvement efforts can continue to take place alongside core permitting work and expectations from state, EPA, and stakeholders are satisfied. Next slide, please. I'm going to briefly discuss how DEQ addressed the 4 areas where EPA identified issues. For data, DEQ identified a training need regarding testing data entry into the data management system known as ACES. DEQ provided updated training to staff to conduct this work and clarified workflow expectations. DEQ also set up a QA/QC process to prevent this from reoccurring in future SRFs. For inspections, DEQ updated inspection report templates and conducted training in April during an air quality staff webinar to introduce these improved templates. Improvements and consistency are the goal of the state review framework, and that work is always ongoing. Templates and work practices will continue to be updated and improved for both permit writing and inspections through different groups that discuss these core work items. For violations, DEQ already had a form for violations. This form was updated and the instructions were clarified. This was a group effort by headquarters with input from air quality DEQ managers, inspectors, OCE, and the EPA. The EPA actually emphasized and complemented the work on addressing this finding. For enforcement, DEQ's update to violation form template included clarification on timelines. Additionally, the training was held in April for DEQ air quality staff, which was provided by EPA Region 10. The training including a detailed review of enforcement expectations, classification, scope, examples of violations, violation criteria, and timelines. Similar to the Secretary of State audit, improving processes is ongoing work. Air quality has implemented solutions to address all these issues identified in the SRF, and EPA considers all these issues to be resolved. That being said, DEQ acknowledges that ongoing work improvements and evaluations are necessary to sustain air quality permitting and inspections in the most effective and efficient service levels. I'm going to turn it back to Ali to discuss ongoing evaluation tools air quality utilizes. Ali?
Thank you, Jacqueline, and good, pay attention to the puppy. Again, DEQ uses several mechanisms to track agency progress, as we discussed earlier in reviewing the progress in the earlier part of the information session. One is the key performance indicators, which are measures that report agency data to the legislature. A few that are specific to air are timely new permit issuance, timely modifications, and overall current permit percentages, or opposite of backlog. The other main progress tracking tool is called quarterly measures review. This recurring review of agency progress is an internal function and includes more and specific metrics. A few that are air permitting focused include current permits, or what is not backlog, inspection timelines, permit issuance timelines, including modification, renewals, and new permits. We've added 2 new reporting functions within our permitting databases. These 2 reports are specifically to view permit backlog status and permit timelines by permit type. For air permit backlog and inspection QMRs, we have remained constant on all except for a slight decrease in overall permit backlog. Managers meet twice per month to discuss current status and progress. Generally speaking, these measurement tools allow the EQ to initiate improvements, then refer to these measures pre and post to note the effectiveness of our strategies. The program can then make the informed decision on types of process improvements that yield the best results in relation to the core work and deliverables. While these measures help the EQ analyze progress, the highest priority at this time is the overall permit backlog. Next one, please. So here you can see where we are regarding issuance of permits that take significant staff time. As the majority of permitting work is associated with renewals compared to new permits, this specifically shows the renewed permits needed to achieve the backlog goal of 10% that we established overall by 2025, accounting for some time spent on new permits and permit modifications. Over the past few years, the program has issued approximately 45 permits per year. To be on track to meet our goal, we need to reach about 66 permit renewals a year. This graph shows simple and standard ACDP and Title V operating permits. It excludes basic ACDPs as they don't take a significant amount of staff time to issue, but the overall permit backlog will account for a few of them being issued per year as well. Our focus on the backlog thus far has reduced some of the more complex Title V and standard permit backlogs, with a slight increase to simple ACDPs. Between these three more complex permit types, the overall backlog was 38% in 2017 at the time of the audit, and is 32% as of this September. With a 10% backlog goal in mind, estimates showed that without significant action on current backlog trajectory will increase overall by 2025. As stated by the Secretary of State audit, the program requires funding and FTE to align workload and staff levels. So this significant action could include a fee increase providing program sustainment and additional positions for permitting work, which we'll cover in the next agenda item. Next. So current permits are important to the regulated facilities, DEQ and the community, and they provide regulatory certainty to facilities. We assure the community that most up-to-date standards and emission analysis are included and are a key function of DEQ's core work. Overall, air quality is continually making adjustments and improvements to its permitting and inspection. While the long-term benefits of these more recent improvements are still unknown and will be realized over time, it is unlikely that they will result in enough efficiency to negate the need for additional staff. The issuance of an additional 21 permits per year is a significant workload to meet our backlog reduction goal. DEQ must react when construction permit or permit modifications are submitted, creating a ripple effect throughout the program's other priority work. Permitting has become more complex over time, requiring more staff and higher level staff to effectively write permits. And while all the recommendations have been provided to the program have been implemented or are in the process of being implemented, there's always room for continued improvements, and we will continue to do so. The most effective way to reduce the backlog, align the program with the Secretary of State audit and comprehensive workload analysis, and continue to deliver on core work commitment is to establish additional resources and positions. Again, also the thing that also bothers, concerns me is, the turnover rate and the new staffing training is absolutely is a concern of ours, and succession planning is something that weighs heavy on my mind. But with that, I'll conclude, and thank you for your time, and I'll take any questions you may have.
Commissioners, do we have any questions for Ali or the team at this point? Director.
Well, seeing no questions from the commission, thank you, Chair George. For the record, Richard Whitman. Just a few contextual remarks for this presentation, which I want to give the commission. We gave a similar presentation to the commission at the last commission meeting regarding the water quality permitting program. And so the purpose of the presentation today is really just to bring you all up to date on this important core work in the air permitting program. This is a key part of the work of DEQ to protect public health in Oregon. And it's an area that we have had historic problems with performance in the agency, largely through disinvestments that have been made in the agency over a long period of time, and resulting loss of resources, loss of staff, loss of expertise, combined with this, as you just heard, a program that's getting more complex over time. So I'm very pleased with the effort that Ali and his team, including Jacqueline and others, have made to turn the corner on this. It is very similar to the effort that's gone on in the water quality permitting program, and we still have a long way to go. But I feel like we're on the right track, as evidenced by the reviews that have been done both by the Oregon Secretary of State and the federal EPA, which have identified particular areas where improvements needed and specific steps that needed to be taken. And those steps we are taking those steps. So again, thank you to Ali, thank you to the team and Air Quality for the work. We still got a long way to go, and this is still a high priority area for the agency to keep a close eye on this and the progress that we're making in this area. And with that, I will stop and turn it back to you, Chair George.
Okay, thank you for that. We appreciate it. Commissioner Addington.
Oh, thank you, Chair. I too want to just acknowledge the staff here and some of the work that's gone on. This one is tough for me. It really is. I mean, it's I really am concerned about the effect of this on some small businesses, on things like auto body shops and gas stations, and particularly in rural areas. But I also acknowledge that the legislature took action on this. It's our job to implement this program. And I will say that, you know, having a backlog on the permits is, you know, it's just going to undermine the public's trust, not only in, you know, government, but also in the businesses, the industry. So I do think it's important, and I really want to, it's just that 70% is a big pill to swallow, and I understand how we got here. It's been time, and I want to thank you guys for at least doing the implementation over 3 years, being able to phase that in if a business chooses. So it's a tough one. I don't like these big fee increases. I worry about the effect on small business, but I know we need to get it done, so I'm going to support it.
Thank you for that, Commissioner. Well said. Appreciate those sentiments. Yes, Director.
Yeah, just again to clarify, the presentation that you just heard is really intended to communicate to the Commission the work that we're doing in this area to improve program performance and why it's important and what progress we've made. We now will have a presentation on the proposed fee increase that Commissioner Addington was just referring to for the air contaminant discharge permit program. And specifically, we'll talk about the resources that would be funded by the fee increases and what we have done to phase in over a long period of time those fee increases in order to avoid as much as possible economic impact, particularly on the smaller sources of air pollution here during this really difficult economic time for the entire state. So we know this is a balancing act for everybody. It was a balancing act for the legislature. It's a balancing act for the agency. It's a balancing act, as Commissioner Addington said, for the sources that are paying for this, but also do benefit from the program and from the public trust that they are taking the steps that's necessary to protect their neighbors. So with that, I'll be quiet again, and but the next presentation will go into the specifics about the particular fee increases. Thank you.
And apologies for getting ahead of you. I'll reference my comments here in a few more minutes.
No problem.
Well, I think we all know where we're going next. So, still relevant. And unless I hear any, or I see any madly waving hands, I would say let's do just that. Let's proceed into the specifics in action item E.
Chair George, Commissioners, again, for the record, Ali Mirzakalili, I appreciate your indulgement. You have to bear with me for one more presentation. I'm here now to introduce proposed adjustments to the fee structure for the state air permitting program known as ACDP, or Air Contaminant Discharge Permits Program. Again, I want to stress that EQ is committed, like I said earlier, like Dr. Whitman said, to balancing its obligation to protect the environment while being considerate of the dramatic disruption that caused by the COVID-19 outbreak. For that reason, both the rule options that we'll provide you and include here today demonstrate significant effort on our part to mitigate the economic impact to sources, particularly the small businesses. Matt Davis will be joining me to co-present, and Jacqueline Palermo for Air Operations Section Manager, Dan DeFer, Lead Route Writer, and Melinda Mahoney, who's our Air Quality Budget Analyst, are also available to provide additional information or answer any questions you may have during the presentation. So with that, please go to the next slide. Again, we'll hope to cover today's several items and at times refer back to the information from the previous presentation on core work. We want to cover the information about the program, existing challenges to our work, process improvements that we've implemented, the context of this rulemaking, including the need for additional resources, and 2 different fee options for your consideration, followed by the program recommendation. Next one, please. So as a reminder, there are 4 permit categories that make up the ACDP program. As sources grow in complexity, so do the applicable requirements. This progress from the least complex basic permits to most complex standard permits. Operations permitted under the ACDP program vary widely from rock crushers to gasoline stations to data centers to large semiconductor manufacturing facilities. Each permit category shown on the screen is followed by the approximate number of permittees. We've also called out the number of new permits that have been applied for and not yet issued by DEQ. This is just to illustrate that this work hasn't stopped. Next slide, please. So the state's most complex and highest emitting facilities are regulated on Title V of the Federal Clean Air Act Amendment. These proposed rules do not affect Title V annual fees. They also do not raise or otherwise impact any Clean Air Oregon fees. There are 3 types of ACDP fees. Annual operation fees, one-time fees assessed for new permits, and specific activity fees. These are one-time fees that correspond with particular permit modifications. This slide shows the funding structure of the program. On the left, you'll see that approximately 90% of the ACDP revenue is from fees, and the remaining 10% is from general fund and federal funds that we receive. Of the 90% program revenue from fees, approximately 91% is from annual operating fees, and the remaining 9% is from the specific one-time fees that I mentioned earlier. Of all fee revenues, 54% is from more complex, simple and standard permits, while 46% is from less complex basic and general permits. Next slide, please. So DEQ issues federal Title V operating permits for major sources of emissions by federal law. These permits only allow a facility to operate. Before operating, the source must receive an ACDP construction permit. All Title V sources first have an ACDP permit before transitioning into their federal operating permits. Clean Air Oregon is the state's health risk assessment process for stationary sources. The program applies to all new sources when they apply for a permit and to existing sources based on a call-in schedule. Any new risk reduction measures required by the Clean Air Oregon are incorporated into the source's existing permit. The ACDP program plays an important role in meeting our national ambient air quality standards, for which you showed the trend line earlier. That's required by the Clean Air Act. ACDP functions as a means to regulate both the construction and operation of sources, helping to ensure ambient air quality standards are met.
Just a second.
Environmental regulations, both federal and state specific, that help maintain compliance with the NAAQS are established in the ACDP as permit conditions. Oregon state implementation plans submitted regularly to EPA demonstrates how all of these applicable requirements that will be included in permits help to maintain compliance with the NAAQS. The ACDP program also ensures that regulations with well-documented environmental and public health benefits are incorporated into operating permits through explicit permit conditions. Implementing federal regulations, state-specific standards, and over time, risk assessment, and limitations through CAO, helps to ensure that the public and environment are protected from harmful air pollution and associated health risks. The ACDP program has 6 primary elements, as you can see on the screen. These include issuing new permits, renewing existing permits, issuing permit modifications, reviewing reports and emission calculations, conducting inspection, processing enforcement actions, following up with complaints, and providing technical assistance to applicants and permittees. All of these functions are completed by regional permit writers and inspectors. Next slide, please. Again, as discussed during the core work presentation, an audit conducted by Secretary of State found that DEQ is not renewing complex air quality permits on time and does not consistently meet inspection targets. The audit identified a number of factors contributing to the permit renewal backlog, including competing priorities and unmanageable workload caused by budget and staffing cuts. Since the audit, DEQ has made significant progress in addressing all of the 10 Secretary of State recommendations. A follow-up audit conducted in 2019 found, and I quote, overall, DEQ has taken significant steps to either fully implement or begin implementing all 10 of the audit's recommendations. The recommendations within DEQ's controls were promptly addressed. However, the recommendation that DEQ work with stakeholders and legislatures to increase resources required legislative approval, which was done in 2019 and now requires approval from the Commission. Next slide, please. Since 2011, this is shown here on the chart, the number of permitted facilities, and I think you can hit up a couple of times, I think, no, go back. Okay. This is not, it doesn't show the permitted, this is not the right slide, but anyway, I'll walk you through it, I apologize. The number of permitted facilities have stayed relatively constant while permitting positions have declined, as you can see here, by approximately 25% from approximately 35 to 26 positions here. This reduction is directly related to the backlog of permit renewal illustrated in the Secretary of State audit and inspection deficiencies found by EPA. DEQ has not adjusted fees since 2013. This adjustment was designed to sustain the program for 4 years. DEQ sought legislative authorization for the planned fee increases during 2017 session. The increase was not authorized because of the stakeholder concerns related to Clean Air Oregon rules, which were still in early days of development at that time. Because the increase was not authorized, the program permanently lost 4 FTE. That's shown in the middle row there. The legislative approval of the 4 general fund position in 2018 also indicated towards the latter part. The fee legislation authorizes the position, in 2019 authorized 6 new positions through the policy package 116. These positions are contingent on the Commission adopting a fee increase to sufficiently fund them. While the the impacts of COVID-19 are wide-reaching and prevalent across the state, EQ has yet to see these impacts directly in the permitting program. Since March of 2020, there has not been a decline in new permit applications or an increase in facilities either terminating air permits or entering into temporary closures.
Just a moment. Director, did you have something you wanted to add?
No, thank you, Chair George. Ali just hit on the point that I wanted to make sure was made regarding the fact that new applications for new permits in this program have not slowed down.
Got it. Thank you.
So at this point, I would like to turn it over to Matt to talk about the rulemaking process. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks, Ali. Good afternoon, Chair George and Commissioners. For the record, this is Matt Davis, Senior Legislative and Policy Analyst. We can go to the next slide. So this slide illustrates the progression of this particular rule proposal from early stakeholder engagement through the legislative process, bringing to where we are today. I'm not going to walk through each row here, but I'll note that we've been conducting extensive outreach and stakeholder engagement for nearly 3 years in preparation for this fee adjustment. As you recall, this commission approved the inclusion of an ACDP fee increase in the department's 2019-2021 agency request budget. Since that time, we've continued to refine proposals in response to stakeholder input, public comment, and the economic uncertainties caused by the COVID-19 pandemic. We're really proud of our stakeholder work and engagement on this proposal. We have consistently engaged stakeholders with really an eye toward fee-paying stakeholders all along the way. And when the legislature approved this increase in the 6 new permit writing positions, they did so without receiving any opposing testimony. I also want to note that because of the long lead time for this particular approach, we notified all 2,500 permittees last fall that there was a possibility of a fee increase in 2020. In that notice, we also provided really detailed directions on how permittees could track the rulemaking and engage in that public process. Next slide. So just taking a step back, I want to talk briefly about the nature of some of those stakeholder conversations. In the course of really years of meetings, DEQ in partnership with fee-paying stakeholders identified 4 shared expectations or outcomes for the ACDP program you can see on the screen. In order for the agency to deliver on all 4 expectations, the program must be fully resourced and fully staffed. The expectations represent areas of mutual agreement, those that DEQ and permittees find equally important. Continued improvements in these efforts are really the driving force behind the need for the investment we're here to talk about today. As identified, the stakeholders in DEQ found that a sufficiently permitted program can and should provide effective technical assistance and promptly respond to inquiries from the regulated community, issue high quality and detailed permits that sufficiently explain the requirements in a clear way, provide regulatory certainty by issuing permits in a timely manner, and clearly communicate application expectations when processing new permits. And while DEQ has made progress, as you heard, in addressing some of these themes, these are really areas where the program has had difficulty in delivering in recent years because of reduced staffing levels. Next slide, please. So before diving into the particulars of the 2 options, I just want to highlight some of the ways in which DEQ has mitigated the fiscal impact to fee payers, in particular small businesses. These strategies are included in both option 1 and 2, and some have been further modified or enhanced in response to COVID-19. So compared to the legislatively approved fee increase, both options reduce the fiscal impact to most permittees by either phasing in or outright deferring increases. Additionally, both options reduce the overall fee increase for the least complex basic permittees. Both options create a new basic permit for certain sources that would otherwise need to obtain the more complex and costly simple ACDP permit. And while both options adjust those one-time specific activity fees, they do not adjust the most commonly paid fee, the fee that's most commonly paid by about 90% of our fee payers. That fee is staying the same. Both options establish a construction fee for projects that have a more than de minimis emissions increase, but exempt general and basic permittees from that fee. And both options allow for payment plans, which DEQ will be more aggressively communicating this fall. And finally, new to ACDP, both options establish a process for fee payers to request a partial or full waiver due to economic hardship. Next slide, please. So as Ali mentioned, the ACDP program has lost positions consistently since the 2009-2011 biennium, with the exception of 4 positions that are generally funded that the legislature authorized in 2018. The rule options presented today represent years of collaboration between legislators, industry, environmental advocates, DEQ, and others. And even with the legislative approval to obtain additional funds and positions, DEQ has been really mindful of the statewide and global impacts of COVID-19. And that's why the options we ultimately are bringing forward to you today have been modified significantly from what the legislature approved as part of our budget. In preparing these options, our goal has been to maintain the ACDP program while further reducing the impact of fee payers, largely by delaying or phasing in increases that were otherwise were set to take effect this fall. Because DEQ's current biennium budget was built with the assumption of an ACDP fee increase, both options today, modifications to what the legislature approved, represent cuts to our current biennium budget. The distinguishing feature between the options is that option 2 delays increases for 90% of fee payers. In effect, this means DEQ will not have the resources to hire 4 of the 6 legislatively approved positions, delaying our ability to address the permit and inspection backlog. And finally, based on budget projections, no increase this year, shown illustrated with the red dashed line, would leave the ACDP program facing about a $3 million shortfall next biennium. In order to balance, we would need to eliminate 10 of the 35 positions. That's a nearly 30% reduction to our staffing levels, and a cut of that magnitude, as you would expect, seriously jeopardizes DEQ's ability to perform really basic permitting functions, issuing permits for new sources, incorporating the latest federal regulations, and conducting basic compliance inspections. Next slide. So with that, the next 4 slides kind of walk through the 2 options, both in represented as percent increases and real dollars. So option 1, the first increase, reduces the legislatively authorized increase in revenue by about 50% by phasing in the increase for 90% of permittees over 3 years, as shown on the screen. In this option, in the first year, in the next year, the bulk of revenues come from the more complex, simple and standard ACDPs, which would see 1 increase this fall. The remainder of permittees would see a phased-in increase over 3 years. This option allows DEQ to hire 4 of the 6 newly authorized positions, delaying the other 2 until next biennium. And option 1 provides for much smaller increases to the majority of fee payers than originally proposed. This positions DEQ to continue making improvements in those 4 key priority areas I discussed and improve our timely delivery of services. It's also really important to note that under this option, we think we can honor our commitment made to advisory committee members that the department wouldn't need additional fee adjustments for approximately 6 years to sustain the program. Next slide, please. The second option further mitigates the impact to all fee payers by foregoing any increase this year for approximately 90% of permittees and phasing in the increase after that. While this option allows the program to continue operating at current service levels, it does represent a significant budget cut, reducing those new revenues approved by the legislature by about 70%. As you can see, this option delays fee increases for 90% of permittees until next year and then phases them in over 2 years, and phases in the increase for the remaining 10% of facilities over 2 years beginning this December. The effect on DEQ is that we would need to delay, we would be able to hire 2 of the 6 positions next year and need to delay the remaining 4 until the next biennium. And given the onboarding process for new hires, it's reasonable to expect that we would not be able to perform additional backlog reduction work until late 2021. Additionally, under this option, it's not certain that DEQ would have sufficient and stable funding through 2025 as we originally committed to during the rulemaking process. Next slide. So the next 2 slides show the same options, but in real dollars. So as you know, and have heard several times today, that there are 10 ACDP fee categories corresponding to the 10 columns you see on the screen. And the bottom row is the facility count for each category. And the dollar amounts associated with these fee categories range really widely, corresponding to the diverse nature of permitted operations. So we try to, all of this, real dollar information is in the staff report, but for kind of ease of reference, we've tried to call out some of the more common permit categories. I would note the basic permit, which is how auto body shops are permitted. They have paid $432 per year since 2014, and under option 1 would pay an additional $65 this year and next, followed by an $86 increase in year 3. Gas stations are actually the most common type of facility permitted under ACDP. They pay right now an annual fee of $144, and you can see the corresponding increases as they progress over 3 years. And then finally is under option 1, simple and standard permits only, well, not only, they face 1 increase this fall. And you can see that the magnitude of that in real dollar amounts. Again, a standard permit, that is how some semiconductor manufacturing facilities, some large wood products manufacturing facilities, that's the permit category of which they fall in. Currently, they pay approximately $9,200 a year, and they would see a $6,500 increase. Next slide, please. So this again is option 2 in real dollars. I'm not going to belabor the point or kind of walk you through the dollars. I would just reiterate that again, under option 2, basic and all of the general permit categories would pay no increase this year, followed by a 2-step increase. And those more complex, simple and standard permittees would pay a 2-step increase starting this fall, with the effect on the agency being delay of hiring of those new positions, and as a result, delayed work towards addressing our backlog. So with that, I'm going to turn it back to Ali for the staff recommendation in closing, and then we'll be available for questions.
Thank you, Matt, very much. The Chair George, just for the final a couple of slides, would like to recommend that EQC move to adopt attachment A of option 1, chapter 40 of chapter 340 of Oregon Administrative Rule. And the reason is the option is designed to minimize the fiscal impact to fee payers, establishing the smallest emitters, especially the smallest emitters, by reducing the total legislatively approved fee impact by 50%. It does this by phasing in the increases for 90% of the fee payers, resulting in a relatively modest dollar amount increase each year. This option provides sufficient funding for DEQ to continue improving its core work and addressing its backlog. We believe this option balances the impact to fee payers with the needs to have a sufficiently resourced permitting program, critical to fully meeting DEQ's mission to be the leader in restoring, maintaining, and enhancing the quality of Oregon's air. And finally, it will provide stable funding for us through 2025 and allow us not to have to go back for additional fee increases in the next biennium. So with that, if you go to the last slide, we have a suggested motion language for your consideration. And I'm open for questions.
All right, commissioners, director, yes, Commissioner Mosby.
Yes, I'm going to follow up a little bit with what Greg said. I had a conversation recently with the CEO of a manufacturing company located in a rural county. They're in a county seat, and he told me that his fees, now granted, he's obviously in the standard category here. It's a fairly large facility, and they also throwing in water, but his DEQ fees this year will be $100,000, over $100,000 more than what he paid last year. And basically that's 2 family wage jobs in a rural county that he could lose if he can't pass those along. So, I'm a supporter of this, but keep in mind, we're trying to add people, but it could impact in these tough economic times, some of us, especially in rural areas, big time. I mean, this is a very serious thing. And I think, Greg was talking about some of the other categories that may be lower, but these big people, they're having a tough go too, these manufacturers. So we just need to keep that in mind. What we want sometimes really impacts our customers.
Thank you, Commissioner Mosby. And we will give Commissioner Addington full credit for his comments in this section as well.
I do have one more.
Go right ahead.
Ollie, so just in the evolution of these options, at our last meeting, I think this issue was tabled. You guys went back to the to the drawing board a little bit and looked at ways to be creative, which I appreciate. What about interaction with the regulated community between then and now? Have they weighed in at all with any of these options on, is it all over the board, or has there been outreach to them? Can you just fill me in on that?
Chair George, Commissioner, so that's I do meet with stakeholders periodically. They are concerned about economic impact of COVID and how it will play out. We have talked about how the environmental compliance and regulations may be impacting them. But again, when I also look at resourcing the agency, they are aware of the need to get our core work done and bring the resources and implement the legislation that was approved. With it, the point that the facility that Commissioner Mosby raised, I've talked to them. Part of that fee was associated with a Cleaner Oregon. They were called into that program, and I think it's a sort of that initial fee is hefty. It's a big chunk of that increase that you're mentioning. We are cognizant of it. They are raising the issue to us as for consideration. We've built in relief valves if there is a financial hardship. They can ask for a waiver, can demonstrate it. But we've heard it. They have voicing it. They're voicing it to us. But I think it's for the most part, we've tried to minimize the impact on the smaller businesses, and as you can see here, that's been our main focus.
Commissioner Addington,
Sorry. Just a quick follow-up, Ollie. Thank you, and I do appreciate that you've done that, and there's these options there. I would just be interested to know if there was sort of those two options, if there was more support for one or the other from those that are going to be regulated, if that has been out there amongst the regulated community at all, is all. I mean, to me, there's, the recognition the work needs to get done. You got to deal with the backlog, all this stuff. And you've proposed two ways to do that with pros and cons. And I just wondered what the regulated community thought of it. So that's all.
Thank you, Commissioner Addington. I have not, shopped that options with the regulated community and asked for their preference. That's a question. We have not.
Commissioner Kyle.
Hi, so I just have kind of a couple questions here. One, I want to say that I appreciate that after discussing it last time, you guys went back to the table and were creative about trying to figure out how to make this less burdensome and more cost effective. So I really do appreciate that. One question is, and it ties back to the past presentation, that there's still performance improvements that you need to make that were raised in the audit. And so I'm kind of curious about how long it would take a new air quality permitter to come on board in order to help address some of that backlog. Like, so how long does it take to onboard and train somebody into this program? And then two, I would imagine that there's an educational process in this where they start in kind of with the simpler permits and work their way up into those complex permits. So part of what I'm concerned about from the agency perspective is maintaining a stable workforce so that you do not lose any of the human capital that you've built in this program. So I'm wondering if you could address that point.
Commissioner Carl, that's an excellent question. I think it's one that it's been a challenge for us, recruiting new permit writers, and depending on location, some of the regional offices have had more trouble than Portland location, depending on whether we go after entry-level staff or experienced. It's a tough market for engineers and scientists to recruit at. Sometimes we can't compete on the salary level. in fact, in that market. But we do reach out to, we try to establish a network of, pipeline to get recruit staff and bring them into the door. If we can manage to bring in somebody with experience permitting, certainly that they'll have a less of a learning curve. But generally, if we an entry-level position, it would probably take them about a year before they become effective and competent. And they can produce. So it is a long lead time, and that's why the option one that we said, just the option two just is really slow. Bring in the additional resources in here. It's not going to be allow us to effectively have productive addition to our workforce.
Thanks. I thought it was going to be a long time like that. The second point is, and it was rated more in the staff report, and Ali just referenced it briefly, but one of the things that we were concerned as well about was financial hardship for some of the people that need to get these permits, and what this would mean, particularly in the rural areas and also with the smaller businesses. So could you speak a little more in depth as to what that financial hardship clause would be within this, and how people would know about it, how it would be determined who would be eligible or not eligible for that hardship clause?
Sure, Commissioner Gall. We intend to more broadly and communicate the availability of payment plans. So they can pay. The permit fees can be paid in installments if that's a helpful option for a facility. So that's one way of that we relief that we provide. Also, the providing a waiver option has to be a demonstration of financial hardship. I think it's sort of they have to show but reveal what that the financial situation is, why that the permit fees is unaffordable. I think we can, water quality has a extensive experience in that area. We'll just be adopting that provision. We'll be using their model for financial assessment. I think it's and implementing similar criteria here in our program.
And it wasn't clear in reading through those details who would make that decision. Would this be one that would go up to the director level to make a case-by-case decision, or is it more standardized language that would be able to be determined at a lower administrative level?
Commissioner Connell, our intention is to have the waivers be at the director level, and it will be case by case.
Okay, thank you.
Director, I think I saw your hand. Did you want to comment?
Thank you, Chair George and Commissioner Kyle, for your questions. In responding to your questions in terms of what the effects would be between option one and option two, Ali has been working with Leah Feldon and others in his team really to set a goal for how quickly we want to bring the backlog in permitting and inspections down to where we want it to be on a sustainable basis. And we're still working on that, but how long that will take is going to be dependent on this decision by the commission. And what I can say is that under option one, we are looking at a roughly, and I don't want to be held to this number specifically because I want the team to go through the careful process of setting an appropriate goal, but we're looking at something like a 5-year period to get that backlog down to the level that we want it to be at. If the commission doesn't approve this at all, kind of all bets are off on the backlog. It's probably going to be getting worse. If the commission were to approve option one, we think we can achieve something on that order of a 5-year period to bring the backlog down between the resources and the efficiency process improvement work that we need to do. Option 2 would probably delay that a bit from that period. So that's at a very high level, kind of some of the consequence of the decisions before the commission. And Deputy Director Felton, I don't know if you want to add anything to that or not.
I guess I would just add that one thing you've heard in the water program is looking at different ways of conducting the business and using the resources internally to make sure that, you know, we've really explored innovative ways to use the resources, and the air program is looking for the opportunity to do that as well. So they're you know, beyond just bringing in more resource, I would say it's not necessarily to do business as usual. It's to incorporate the process improvements and also to consider some innovations about how we use the resources, how we divide up the work, what kind of, you know, specialties we have with certain positions. So there's some really good thought already happening about how the resources could be best used to work on the backlog.
Thank you for that. One question I wanted to ask was, in the presentation, there was kind of a timeline, you know, of how we got to where we are today, starting with the stakeholder engagement back in fall of 17. So presuming this work goes forward, but, you know, if it didn't, there were those legislative work sessions back in spring of 2019. What would be the consequence to being able to proceed of further delay? Would we be back at the legislature and trying to redo steps there? That to me seems kind of a troubling prospect in while we're trying to find the best path forward here. That would seem a difficult path.
Yeah, thank you, Chair George, for those questions. Those are good questions. The work on this particular fee increase has been somewhat tortuous, and that has to do. There's no fault of really anybody. A lot of it has to do with just the fact that we were going through a pretty significant policy development process with Cleaner Air Oregon, and it inevitably became part of that conversation with the legislature and stakeholders, because of course if you're a wood products facility, like, you know, we just talked about, you're looking at what's the overall cost of DEQ fees to the facility, and so they are going to look at those things together. We understand that, but unfortunately that led to a significant delay in bringing this forward, and also means that the amount of the increase in percentage terms anyway looks quite large, even though as you've seen, the dollar amounts aren't really necessarily that big, particularly for some of the smaller emitters. So to answer your question, if the commission were to not move forward with a fee increase, and wanted us to start over again, we would need to have that conversation with the legislature. Our agency request budget is already in, so we couldn't do it as part of the normal budget process at this point. We would be seeing if there were an opportunity either in the governor's recommended budget or in conversations with the legislature, and then we'd start the rule process over again. So that would be one scenario. Another scenario would be if we were not to start with the legislature, but start with a rulemaking process. We would go through a rulemaking process and bring it to the EQC, and then we would have to go to the legislature for their ratification. So either way, we're looking at probably a couple-year process to come back to this subject again. if you were not to move forward. So it is, and that's part of a larger conversation about how do we try to figure out a more streamlined process around these fee increases. And that's an issue that we share with other agencies, and it's a bigger discussion with the legislature about how to be more efficient so we don't have multiple policy bodies essentially trying to answer the same question multiple times, which is getting very labor intensive for us. It chews up a lot of staff time. It chews up a lot of time for our stakeholders. And so I think we all have a shared interest in trying to make it more efficient.
I'm sure. Yeah, while fee increases are never desirable for a regulated community, we certainly do understand that multiple processes over an extended processes to get to the same bottom line is sometimes not something that they would appreciate either, I think. So, all right. Anyone else? Is that you, Ali? Do you have something else for us?
I just wanted to add one of the issues that was we've approached with the stakeholders, and we talked about it when we were in discussion of this fee, is trying to create find opportunities to how we can adjust the fees more frequently and less dramatically, so we can keep up with the cost of living and what that process would look like. So we're just not bringing these cliff-like increases in front of you and ask for those type of increases. So that's a longer conversation. We're hoping to engage with you and others and see figure out a pathway that would get us there over the and find a different way of setting fees. So I appreciate the challenge, though.
Yes, thank you for that, Ali. I think that's consistent with what we've heard in some other areas, looking for a little bit more gradual approach that can be kind of built into the cost of doing business. All right, but as you said, we understand that is also a larger discussion. Okay, commissioners, further questions or comments? All right, well, hearing none, we've seen the staff presentation and the options presented before us. I think as a way to proceed, I would ask if we have a motion in support of what was described as option 1, the proposed motion language.
Yeah, so this is Commissioner Kyle for the record. I think this program has been had a lack of investment for quite a while. So I move that the Environmental Quality Commission adopts the proposed rules as seen in attachment A of the staff report for this item as part of Chapter 340 of the Oregon Administrative Rules, and improve incorporating these rule amendments into Oregon Clean Air State Implementation Plan under OAR 340-200-0040, and direct DEQ to submit the SIP revision to the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency for approval. And I would propose that option 1.
Thank you for making the motion, Commissioner. Do we have a second?
I second that motion.
Motion's been made and seconded. Do we require further discussion, commissioners? Hearing none, those in favor of the motion signify by saying aye.
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 Those opposed signify same sign. Any abstentions?
Abstain.
We register you as an abstention. Commissioner Mosby, is that correct?
That's correct.
Thank you. All right, hearing all positions, the motion passes. And we thank everyone. We thank the commissioners, we thank the staff and the folks who have come a very long way under some difficult circumstances to create some flexibility and to do what we can to work with the regulated community. So thank you, everyone, very much.
Thank you, Chair George. Thank you, commissioners.
All right. Well, we only have one last informational agenda item for the day, which usually is a pretty short one. The commissioner reports. Commissioners, does anybody have anything about the work that we've been doing or the meetings we've had since our last EQC meeting that you feel would be worthwhile sharing with the group this afternoon?
So this is Commissioner Kyle. Last week we had an OWEB meeting, and while most of it was also spent with trying to figure out how we will move in the future with the given budget constraints and economic hardships that the state is facing, I did want to bring to attention one of the items that we talked about, which was really around natural and working land goals related to natural climate solutions and why they're important when we're talking about greenhouse gases. I think our State of Oregon report that we heard at the beginning of today's meeting really illustrated some of the overlapping issues between what DEQ is involved with and regulates with, the other agencies, transportation, agriculture, and forestry. And so I was very impressed and enjoyed hearing about some of the natural climate solutions that OWEB and the governor's office was talking about, including like carbon sequestration potentials of Oregon's forests and working lands as a way to really bring together both the natural and working landscape into some of the climate mitigation strategies that we're going to have to face, as well as some of the more man-made infrastructure. So I think that's an exciting conversation that's happening in the state. And I look forward to kind of learning more about it myself, as well as sharing that with the commission.
Thanks very much, Commissioner Kyle. I too am very interested to learn more about that. And so, as that work continues, if there's opportunities to maybe listen in and learn, I'd appreciate knowing about them, and other commissioners might as well, just as we're all learning about how we can move forward in these ways. Anybody else? Commissioner Addington.
Just quickly, this veers off a little bit, probably from the DEQ a little. But, I do a lot of work around the Southern Oregon area, and the fires that went through communities like Talent and Ashland and parts of Medford. I don't think I need to tell anyone how devastating it's been for some of those places and those communities, as well as other ones throughout the state. I'm obviously more familiar down here. One of the things that I think about a lot and has come up in some of the meetings I've been involved with is, affordable housing is a huge issue in all over, but particularly these areas as well. And when you look at the loss of, some of the facilities in those areas, a lot of what I guess I would say is affordable housing. A lot of trailer parks, a lot of places where workforce housing, apartments, things like that. So I say all that just to say we're going to be in for a world of hurt here, just as a community and as a state. And I think there's going to be some efforts to look at how do we replace that? Is there a way to fast track replacing some of these things in a way that follows building codes, in a way that, looks out for the health and safety. But I guess, Director, I just kind of raise that up to your level, because I think this is something that the state, I'm sure, probably is looking at, but all the agencies need to be able to look at this and work together, because there's going to be a lot, and I can't even imagine the environmental impacts of what's happened there, with water and obviously air. But anyway, just the rebuilding process and however state agencies can work together to make that as efficient as possible.
Director.
Yes, thank you, Chair George. And I'll just give a brief response now, and I'll probably talk about this a little bit more as part of the director's report in the morning. But I want you all to know that Governor Brown has convened a disaster cabinet around the wildfire situation in the state, and that I'm participating in that cabinet along with other agency directors. DEQ's role is around recovery of communities. I sit in that cabinet along with Margaret Salazar, who's the Director of Housing and Community Services for the state. And we are talking about these issues, and we are also working with FEMA and other federal agencies looking at how to respond to the really great needs that are going to be out there in many communities around the state, that are already out there in many communities around the state. So even as fires are continuing to spread in a few places in Oregon, and we're mindful of that also, we have other places where people are getting back and seeing what the status of their homes is, and thinking about rebuilding and rebuilding quickly, particularly given the time of year that we're at. Many of these communities were lower income communities, a lot of mobile homes. So it's going to be difficult issues, and it's going to take coordinated work of government agencies. We also have foundations stepping up in a big way to help with resources around housing as well. So more to come on this, but yeah, a lot is happening in real time on these issues right now. I spent most of the morning on these issues, and probably will be spending a lot of time for some months to come just on the initial stages of this work. But thank you for raising it.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. Any other commissioners wish to add something to the report? I guess I would simply add that as reported at the last EQC meeting, our conversations with the Oregon Department of Forestry have continued, at least until recently, right? And then everything had to change and the work had to be diverted. And we all understand that. We all understand that that's what needed to happen. But we will certainly be continuing that work. I guess the only thing I would share is I recently had the opportunity to participate in an Oregon Tribes meeting. And one of the issues that came up is in the context of state environmental priorities, the question was asked, well, first the statement was made that there seemed to be some new level of interest in environmental justice matters, that this seems to be, it's always been a small part of the conversation, but it was often kind of a sidelined detail of the conversation. And now we're hearing more, just as in our earlier air-related conversations, people taking these issues of environmental justice very much to heart, and it's becoming more of a forefront of the policy discussion. And so the question that was posed at this Oregon Tribes meeting is, what does this mean for tribes? Kind of the perception that maybe that's often an issue raised in a metropolitan context, and it is important in that context. It's very important in that context, but sometimes there's the perception, at least on behalf of some tribes, that they're kind of forgotten out in rural areas and that they have environmental justice issues too. So not too much in detail to say on that, but just that it's part of the conversation that's starting to be being had, and that I'm sure it will touch upon our work as we move forward. All right, anything else? Yes, Director.
Again, I know I'm keeping people a little late, but just on environmental justice and equity work, you're going to hear more about that tomorrow morning in the director's report. We're going to have, I'm going to talk a little bit about that work, and then we're going to have a representative of the union that represents DEQ workers, Eric Feely, also has asked to speak to the commission, and I've told him he can do that as part of the director's report about equity work at DEQ. So the focus there is a little bit more on the internal and what are we doing to encourage and support diversity within the agency. But I also will talk about the environmental justice work. And I also participated along with DEQ staff this morning in a scoping session for our greenhouse gas climate work specifically on impacted communities and environmental justice. And of course, that includes Black, Indigenous, and other communities of color, other frontline communities that are being affected by climate change. So again, I'll talk about that a little bit more tomorrow.
Very good. More to come.
Yep.
All right. Not seeing any other hands at this time. Let's go ahead and recess our meeting now at 5:13, and we will reconvene tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. Thank you, everybody, for our long afternoon and some good work that took place today. Everybody stay safe and get a good night's rest, and we'll talk tomorrow morning. Take care. We are recessed.
Thank you.